Welcome to At Midnight, the late night dive into history, myths, and legends. Tonight, the archive opens on a planet assembled from dust, remodeled by oceans and life, and inherited very late by creatures who began writing dates on things. Earth took more than 4.5 billion years to reach that small administrative complication, so there is plenty of ground to cover. This is At Midnight. Let's step into the dark. Before there was an Earth, there was material in motion. A young sun occupied the center of a broad rotating disk, while gas, mineral dust, and grains of metal traveled around it. Nothing in this disk resembled a finished planet. The ingredients were spread thinly, heated unevenly, and repeatedly disturbed. Yet some of the smallest objects made, there would become the oldest dated solids known from the solar system. They survive inside meteorites as pale, irregular pieces called calcium aluminum-rich inclusions. These minerals formed where temperatures were high enough to favor refractory substances, the compounds that condense only when much else remains vapor. Their lead isotopes place them at about 4,567,300,000 years old. That date is often treated as the opening mark on the solar system's long calendar. It is not the birthday of a complete Earth. Planets, being inconsiderately complicated, took additional time. Other small objects formed in the disk as well. Chondrules were once molten droplets, later cooled into rounded grains. Dust clung to dust through weak electrical forces. Collisions made some clusters larger and broke others apart. As bodies grew, gravity became more effective. A larger body could pull passing material toward itself, increasing the chance of another collision and still more growth. Pebbles became parts of asteroids. Asteroids and other planetesimals became raw material for planetary embryos. The process was less like careful construction and more like a workshop in which every tool was also falling into every other tool. Much of that early material was changed beyond recognition. Heat altered it. Collisions mixed it. Planets pulled it inward, while the young sun carried other portions away. Meteorites matter because some escaped complete recycling. They preserve chemical relationships from a time before the rocky planets had settled into their later forms. Earth presents a special difficulty to anyone seeking its age. Its surface is active. Rock melts, crystallizes, erodes, sinks, rises, and becomes new rock. The planet has spent most of its existence destroying the first pages of its own archive. By the 20th century, estimates of Earth's age had improved greatly, but a reliable numerical answer required a clock that did not depend on finding a piece of the original terrestrial crust. Claire Patterson found that clock and lead. He worked with isotope ratios from meteorites, including material associated with the Canyon Diablo meteorite. Radioactive uranium decays through known chains into forms of lead. Comparing related isotope ratios can reveal elapsed time without assuming that every sample began with no daughter product at all. Several samples that formed from the same broad reservoir can define a relationship, and independent systems can be checked against one another. The method is powerful, but it asks for measurements of extraordinary delicacy. Patterson's problem was that lead was everywhere. It came from laboratory dust, plumbing, paint, fuel, equipment, and ordinary air. Samples carrying tiny ancient signals could be overwhelmed by modern contamination. An analysis might appear to describe the early solar system while mostly describing the room in which the analysis occurred. The rocks had waited billions of years, only to encounter the 20th century and its enthusiasm for spreading lead around. Patterson responded by making his work cleaner and cleaner. Glassware was treated carefully. Air and surfaces were controlled. Procedures that later became familiar in clean laboratories were pursued because stray lead could spoil the result. The effort was not an ornamental chapter in the story of discovery. It was part of the discovery. A number is only as trustworthy as the route by which the sample reached the instrument. In 1956, Patterson published an age of 4,550,000,000 years, with an uncertainty of about 70 million years. Later measurements refined the modern estimate to about 4,540,000,000 years. His value was remarkably close. The oldest inclusions in meteorites are slightly older because they date the first solids, not the final assembly of Earth. Between those markers lay millions of years of collision, melting, and growth. This distinction keeps the opening chronology honest. There was no morning when the solar system appeared fully furnished. Different objects record different stages. A calcium aluminum-rich inclusion dates an early high-temperature event. A chondrule records another process in the disk. A meteorite parent body has its own history of assembly and heating. Earth's age is inferred through material that shared the early reservoir, but avoided Earth's relentless geology. The result is a calendar assembled from survivors. It begins with microscopic minerals and isotope ratios rather than a recognizable landscape. There were no oceans, forests, or continents in the disk. There was only matter sorting itself by temperature, chemistry, motion, and chance. Yet iron destined for planetary cores was already present. Silicate material that would become mantles and crusts was present too. Water-bearing compounds and other volatile ingredients moved among warmer and colder regions. As the local planetary embryo grew, its gravity widened its reach. Incoming bodies no longer made gentle additions. Their motion became heat on impact. Larger embryos crossed paths, sometimes merging and sometimes scattering fragments into new orbits. The Earth that emerged was not simply a pile of cold stones. It was a hot, repeatedly remodeled body, carrying energy from accretion, compression, radioactive decay, and the movement of dense material within it. The meteorite clock gives that body an age. The next evidence lies in the way the young planet began to separate itself into layers. The growing planet could not keep all its ingredients evenly mixed. Each major collision added energy, and gravity compressed material toward the center. radioactive isotopes released heat from within. Under those conditions, broad regions melted or became soft enough for dense metal and lighter silicate to move differently. Earth began to sort itself. Iron and other dense materials traveled inward through molten or partly molten rock. The phrase that the core sank is convenient, though it makes a planetary process sound like a dropped key. Metal gathered toward the center over time, releasing still more gravitational energy as it moved. Silicate material remained above it and formed the mantle and early crust. This separation, called differentiation, gave Earth the broad internal structure it still has. The modern core is not one solid iron sphere. A liquid outer core surrounds a solid inner core. Heat escaping from the deep planet, along with compositional changes as the inner core grows, helps drive motion in electrically conducting metal. That motion sustains the geodynamo, the process responsible for Earth's magnetic field. The ancient history of that field is difficult to reconstruct because old magnetic signals can be altered when rocks heat or deform. Even so, the field became an important boundary between Earth and charged particles flowing from the sun. Above the core, the mantle moved slowly while shedding heat. At the surface, the earliest crust was vulnerable. Fresh crust could founder, melt again, or be broken by later impacts. Volcanoes and molten regions released gases held within the planet. Water vapor, carbon dioxide, nitrogen-bearing compounds, sulfur compounds, and other substances entered early atmospheres that bore little resemblance to modern air. Free oxygen was not yet abundant. Breathing would have been a remarkably brief experiment had anything with lungs been available to try it. One collision was larger than the ordinary violence of accretion. The broad giant impact framework best explains the origin of the moon. In this family of models, a planetary body struck the young Earth, throwing hot material into orbit. Part of that material gathered into the moon, while Earth was left intensely heated and rapidly changed. The event is supported through consequences rather than eyewitness geology. The Earth-Moon system has a particular angular momentum. The moon has a relatively small iron core. Lunar rocks and Earth's mantle show notable compositional and isotopic similarities. A successful model must account for these facts together, which is where the apparently simple tale becomes less obliging. Older versions often introduced a particular impactor, gave it a convenient name, and allowed it to strike in one clean cinematic scene. The name Theia remains useful shorthand for a hypothetical body, but no fragment arrives with a label. Models vary in the impactor's size, speed, angle, and composition. They vary in Earth's earlier spin and in how thoroughly material from the two bodies mixed. Some use especially energetic collisions or high initial angular momentum. Others rely on equilibration between orbiting material and Earth's hot outer layers after impact. The similarity between lunar and terrestrial material is one reason these alternatives exist. A simple collision might be expected to make much of the moon from the impactor, leaving a detectable chemical difference. Yet, Earth and Moon are strikingly alike in several isotope systems. Simulations can reproduce portions of the evidence, but no recovered historical record fixes one geometry beyond dispute. Giant impact is the strong framework. Its exact cast and choreography remain modeled. Afterward, orbiting debris could gather quickly on astronomical timescales. The moon was initially much closer to Earth. Tidal interaction transferred energy and angular momentum, gradually changing the moon's orbit and Earth's rotation. This later evolution is measurable in several kinds of evidence, but it does not turn the original collision into a fully known event. The young Earth itself may have carried a global or nearly global magma ocean after great impacts. Cooling began at the exposed outer boundary. Crystals formed, separated, sank, or floated according to their composition and density. Gases exchanged between molten rock and atmosphere. The first crust was unlikely to remain quietly in place. It formed on an active interior under continuing impacts, and much of it returned to the mantle. Water belonged to this exchange from an early stage. Some hydrogen-bearing material may have been incorporated during accretion. Primitive asteroid-like bodies delivered additional volatiles. Water moved between mantle, crust, atmosphere, and surface, while some was lost. Comets may have contributed, but hydrogen isotope evidence does not support the old cheerful claim that a late fleet of comets simply filled an empty basin. Earth's oceans did not arrive by one known delivery service. As heat escaped, steam could condense where pressure and temperature allowed. Rain, surface water, hydrothermal circulation, and repeated evaporation may all have occurred amid continued disruption. No intact global record remains to reveal the exact sequence. Models describe possible climates and surfaces, while surviving minerals impose limits on those possibilities. This was still the Hadean, Earth's earliest eon, named from an old image of a world fit for the underworld. The name is memorable, though the evidence has made its simplest interpretation less secure. Major impacts and internal heat certainly mattered. Broad molten conditions occurred, but a continuously fiery, waterless surface, lasting for hundreds of millions of years, no longer fits every clue. The clue that changed the picture is extremely small. It is not a surviving Hadean coastline or a slab of original crust. It is a mineral grain that formed in ancient rock, endured the destruction of that rock, traveled through erosion and sediment, and kept its uranium lead clock. After the core, moon, atmosphere, and first crust had begun their long histories, zircon preserved evidence from the cooling outer world. Zircon is a durable mineral with a useful habit. When it crystallizes, it readily takes in uranium, but usually excludes lead. Uranium then decays into lead at known rates, creating a clock within the crystal. Zircon can survive melting around it, erosion out of its first rock, transport by water, burial in sediment, and later geological disturbance. It is not indestructible, and alteration must be tested, but its resilience makes it an unusually persistent witness. At Jack Hills in Western Australia, ancient zircon grains occur inside rocks that are much younger than the grains themselves. Their original host rocks vanished long ago. The zircons were eroded from those rocks and became sand, then were incorporated into sedimentary material that was later changed again. A grain known by the rather unromantic laboratory identity W74/2-36 was dated to about 4,404,000,000 years, with an uncertainty of 8 million years. Its age places crystallization surprisingly early in Earth's history. Other measurements make the grain more than a clock. Oxygen isotopes within ancient zircons, along with mineral inclusions trapped during growth, are compatible with source rocks that had interacted with liquid water at relatively low temperatures before being melted and recrystallized. That implies differentiated crust and a water cycle of some kind by about 4,400,000,000 years ago. The conclusion is important, but narrower than its popular versions. One zircon does not preserve an ocean. It does not prove that the whole planet was cool, that modern-style continents existed, or that liquid water remained uninterrupted across the Hadean. It records the history of material in its source. Enough ancient grains carry related signals to make early crust and surface water difficult to dismiss, but they do not supply a map. Water itself may have several histories folded together. Minerals in Earth's mantle hold hydrogen. Volcanic outgassing transfers water toward the surface, while subduction in later Earth carries some back down. Water-bearing primitive bodies were available during accretion, and impacts could both deliver and remove volatiles. Hydrogen isotope ratios help compare Earth with meteorites and comets, but candidate sources overlap imperfectly and have changed through later processing. Assigning one exact percentage to each source would be more confidence than the archive allows. The atmosphere also changed with the surface. Early gases reacted with rock and ocean. Carbon dioxide could dissolve in water or become tied into minerals. Volcanic activity renewed gases from the interior. The young sun was fainter than it is now, a puzzle because geological evidence still supports liquid water. Greenhouse gases, clouds, surface reflectivity, atmospheric pressure, and episodic conditions have all been studied as parts of the answer. There is no need to appoint one mechanism sole keeper of the Archean thermostat. Impacts continued while these processes occurred. Lunar craters and samples once encouraged a model of a sharp late heavy bombardment around 3,900,000,000 years ago. Dynamical models can produce episodes in which changing giant planet orbits scatter smaller bodies inward. Yet the provenance of lunar samples is limited, and crater chronology permits a longer decline or more extended interval rather than one narrow, universal spike. This matters because an exact bombardment story can tempt an exact biological story. A single late cataclysm has sometimes been cast as a sterilizing curtain, after which life could begin. The geological case is not settled enough to support that tidy sequence, and life's origin is not dated well enough either. Large impacts could alter environments severely. They could also create hydrothermal systems and leave varied refuges. The honest Hay D Un is not an uninterrupted paradise or an uninterrupted furnace. It is an interval reconstructed from scarce survivors. Scarcity itself is part of the evidence. Earth continually renews its surface. Oceanic crust is especially temporary on geological timescales. Continental crust can survive longer, but it too is eroded, buried, heated, deformed, and melted. The older the interval, the more chances its rocks have had to disappear. Hay D Un zircons survive precisely because the rocks around them did not. By 4 billion years ago, the Archean began. More rocks survive from this eon, though they are still sparse compared with younger archives. Small areas of ancient crust became foundations around which later continents grew. These durable regions are called cratons. They occur in parts of Western Australia, Southern Africa, Canada, and elsewhere, often surrounded by younger additions and marked by long histories of metamorphism. The transition from Hay D Un grain to Archean terrain does not reveal a sudden modern world. Continents were smaller and differently arranged. The mantle was hotter. Volcanic and hydrothermal activity was extensive. Ocean chemistry lacked abundant free oxygen and varied through place and time. How closely surface behavior resembled modern plate tectonics remains debated. The debate partly concerns words. Evidence for local subduction-like processes need not prove a globally connected network of rigid plates. Intermittent mobile regions can differ from continuous modern-style recycling. Researchers look at rock chemistry, pressure and temperature histories, deformation, and paleomagnetism. But the oldest archive has been damaged most. Proposed starting dates depend on which feature counts as the beginning. In those altered rocks, another question appears. Carbon compounds, layered structures, microscopic forms, and unusual chemical fractionation can all be made or changed by life. Some can also arise without it. The first living system left no signed record. Instead, geologists encounter increasingly persuasive traces amid processes that can imitate them. The zircons survived as a mineral witness. Archean rocks would now be asked to preserve something far more fragile. The oldest claims for life are also arguments about what stone can imitate. At Nouveau Ag at Uc in Quebec, ancient hydrothermal rocks contain tiny tubes and filaments. They have been interpreted as remains or products of microbes that lived around iron-rich vents. The host rocks are at least about 3,770,000,000 years old under one interpretation, and perhaps older under another. Both the age and the biological origin of the structures have been debated. that does not make the claim worthless. It makes it an unusually clear example of how early life evidence is judged. Shape alone is not enough, because minerals can grow into suggestive forms. Chemistry alone may not be enough, because non-living reactions can separate isotopes or concentrate carbon. Geological context matters. Repeated patterns matter. Associations among structures, minerals, and possible metabolic products matter. Independent teams and methods matter. A convincing case usually asks several imperfect witnesses to agree. Younger Archaean evidence is more secure, though it still does not reveal a first cell. Stromatolites are layered structures commonly formed when microbial communities trap sediment, bind grains, or cause minerals to precipitate. Some ancient examples preserve shapes and textures compatible with biological growth. Yet similar lamination can form without organisms, so each claim depends on context. Stromatolites are structures, not one species, that persisted unchanged across billions of years. Carbon isotope fractionation offers another line of inquiry. Living metabolism often favors lighter carbon in recognizable ways. Carbon-rich ancient rocks can therefore preserve possible biological signals. Later heat and fluids may alter those signals, while some non-living reactions complicate them. No solitary measurement supplies a portrait of an organism. Together, however, microbial structures, sedimentary settings, chemistry, and microfossils support life. By at least roughly 3,500,000,000 years ago, and perhaps earlier. The origin itself remains beyond the preserved record. Research into abiogenesis, the emergence of life from non-living chemistry, examines hydrothermal systems, shallow pools, wet and dry cycles, mineral surfaces, and ice. Each setting can help particular reactions while making others difficult. No accepted historical location or complete chain of events has been recovered. It would be pleasant if one ancient pool had retained a plaque marking the occasion, but early Earth neglected this basic archival duty. Once life existed, it was microbial for most of planetary history. That statement can sound like an empty pause only because microbes are small. In reality, microbial communities transformed chemical gradients, built layered habitats, recycled carbon and sulfur, and developed varied metabolisms. They occupied sunlit shallows, sediments, hydrothermal environments, and other settings where energy and material could be exchanged. The Archean surface around them differed deeply from the later world. The young sun emitted less energy than it does today. Nevertheless, sedimentary evidence indicates persistent liquid water. Carbon dioxide, methane, clouds, atmospheric pressure, and lower surface reflectivity may have helped keep regions unfrozen, with contributions changing through time. Oceans did not have one fixed chemistry. Iron could remain dissolved where oxygen was scarce. Sulfur compounds and volcanic gases moved through air and water. Continental crust survived in pieces. Cratons became stable cores, but they were not modern continents waiting for names. Granite greenstone terrains, ancient volcanic belts, sediments, and highly changed rocks record repeated crust production and reworking. Proposed early continental assemblies are reconstructions from fragments, matching rock belts, isotope histories, and ancient magnetic directions can suggest former neighbors without placing every block confidently. The behavior of the crust was likely changing as the mantle cooled. Modern plate tectonics involves connected moving plates, spreading centers, subduction zones, and the recycling of oceanic lithosphere. On a hotter early Earth, weaker plates, faster melting, local downwellings, or intermittent mobile behavior may have produced some familiar signatures without operating as the present system does. The question of when plate tectonics began, therefore, has several answers depending on which part of the system is meant. This uncertainty does not prevent tectonics from mattering. Moving and reworked crust creates volcanic arcs, basins, shorelines, and hydrothermal circulation. Weathering moves nutrients toward water. Burial carries carbon and other elements away from the surface for a time. Volcanism returns material from the interior. Even before the exact modern arrangement existed, solid earth and surface chemistry were exchanging matter. Microbes took part in that exchange. Some metabolisms used compounds available in oxygen-poor environments. Others captured sunlight. Photosynthesis did not begin as one modern process. Different organisms use different electron donors and leave different products. At some uncertain point before the major rise of atmospheric oxygen, cyanobacteria evolved oxygenic photosynthesis, using water and releasing molecular oxygen. The innovation did not instantly turn the sky blue in its modern sense or make air breathable. Oxygen entering archean environments encountered an enormous inventory of reduced material. Dissolved iron, volcanic gases, weathering products, and decaying organic matter consumed it. Local oxygen oases could exist near microbial producers, while the wider atmosphere remained nearly oxygen-free. This delay made oxygen's eventual rise an Earth system story rather than a single biological invention. Production had to exceed sinks in enough places and for enough time to leave a planetary signal. Iron in seawater would record part of the contest in repeated mineral bands. Sulfur isotopes would record a change in atmospheric chemistry. The microbial communities had no intention of redesigning Earth. Their waste gas simply kept meeting rock, water, and time. Oxygen first entered a world ready to remove it. In sunlit water, cyanobacteria captured energy and used water as a source of electrons. Molecular oxygen emerged as a byproduct. Nearby organisms and minerals reacted with it quickly, while the atmosphere above retained almost none. For a long interval, biological production could be substantial without producing modern air. Iron made the exchange visible. In oxygen-poor seawater, reduced iron could remain dissolved. Where oxygen became available, iron was oxidized into forms that settled out. Repeated episodes helped create banded iron formations, rocks with layers rich in iron minerals alternating with other sediment. Their details vary among basins and ages, so they are not a single global gauge. Yet, they make the immense appetite of the early ocean for oxygen tangible. Before oxygen could accumulate widely, much iron had to rust on a planetary scale. Other sinks waited as well. Volcanic gases reacted with oxygen. Fresh minerals exposed by weathering consumed it. Organic matter made by photosynthesis could be broken down, using oxygen and returning carbon dioxide. Burial mattered because organic carbon carried into sediment could escape immediate decay. Changes in production, burial, volcanic supply, and weathering all influenced whether oxygen remained local or spread farther. The major atmospheric transition is called the Great Oxidation Event, though event is a generous word for a reorganization lasting many millions of years. It occurred broadly between about 2,450,000,000 and 2,320,000,000 years ago. Oxygen rose from extremely low levels, but not to anything close to the modern atmosphere. Later increases and declines followed. The history is a staircase with uncertain and uneven steps, not one smooth upward line. Sulfur isotopes provide one of the strongest markers. In an atmosphere nearly devoid of oxygen, ultraviolet light can drive reactions that separate sulfur isotopes in ways independent of their mass. These unusual signatures were carried into sediments. Once oxygen and an ozone layer altered atmospheric chemistry, the signal largely disappeared from the surface record. Rocks on either side of the transition therefore preserve a change that no ancient instrument had to measure directly. Ocean chemistry did not change everywhere at once. Surface waters could hold oxygen while deep waters remained iron-rich. Other regions or intervals became rich in sulfide. Nutrients, circulation, productivity, and basin shape created a patchwork. The phrase oxygenated ocean can conceal this variation, much as the phrase modern ocean would conceal every difference between a shallow reef and a deep basin. For organisms adapted to oxygen-free settings, oxygen was reactive and damaging. Many anaerobic lineages persisted in sediments, waters, and microscopic environments where oxygen remained low. The Great Oxidation Event has sometimes been described as a first mass extinction, but the microbial fossil record cannot establish losses in the way younger shells and bones can. Ecological disruption is plausible. A precise roll call is not. Oxygen also offered opportunity. Aerobic respiration can release much more usable energy from organic molecules than many anaerobic pathways. That did not make complexity inevitable, nor did it replace older metabolisms. It changed the range of possible ecological strategies. New minerals formed at the surface. Weathering changed. Methane chemistry and climate were affected. Biology had altered geology, and geology kept determining where biology could operate. The transition occurred near a time of major climatic changes, including Paleoproterozoic glaciations. Links among methane, oxygen, greenhouse conditions, continental weathering, and ice have been investigated, but the sequence was not controlled by one switch. Earth's climate system contained feedbacks, delays, and regional differences, even when the organisms driving part of the change were microscopic. Through the long Proterozoic that followed, oxygen generally remained lower than modern values for extended intervals. Deep seas often stayed chemically stratified. Banded iron deposition changed in abundance and style. The atmosphere and ocean continued to exchange gases with volcanism, erosion, organic burial, and microbial life. Calling this interval stable can be useful only at very broad scale. It contained repeated tectonic assemblies, climate changes, and biological innovations. The most consequential innovations did not arrive with labels. Somewhere within microbial evolution, a partnership joined lineages that had once lived separately. The mitochondria inside later complex cells descend from bacteria. Their incorporation gave eukaryotic cells a lasting internal source of energy conversion. The process was not an organism deciding to invent complexity. Natural selection has no destination and no planning committee, which may explain why it occasionally achieves so much. By the time the last common ancestor of living eukaryotes existed, it was already elaborate. It had mitochondria, a nucleus, internal membranes, and a cytoskeleton that organized movement and shape. Fossils, molecular clocks, biomarkers, and comparison among living cells place pieces of the earlier history differently. None preserves the first encounter. The changed oxygen world supplied new energetic possibilities, while bacterial partnership supplied a new cellular arrangement. Across the long middle of Earth history, those cells would diversify without any need to hurry toward animals. Complex cells expanded the scale on which life could organize itself, but they did not immediately fill the sea with large bodies. Eukaryotes remained microscopic for long intervals, evolving varied ways to feed, move, reproduce, and cooperate. Their history survives through scattered fossils, chemical traces, and the features shared among living lineages. These records overlap without settling every date. The last eukaryotic common ancestor was not a simple cell waiting to acquire its important parts. It already possessed a nucleus around its genetic material. Mitochondria descended from bacteria, internal membranes, and a cytoskeleton. That ancestor stood after a long, invisible history of symbiosis and cellular evolution. Modern bacteria are not unchanged examples of the cells involved. They have been evolving for the same immense interval as every other living lineage. Sexual reproduction appeared within eukaryotic history, reshuffling genetic material between generations. Multicellularity appeared more than once. Animals, fungi, red algae, green plants, and brown algae each belong to histories in which cells formed lasting bodies or colonies with varying degrees of specialization. Larger size could aid feeding, movement, defense, or reproduction. But no single pressure explains every origin. A seaweed and an animal did not solve one common assignment. The physical planet continued its own slow rearrangement. Ancient continental blocks came together and separated. Researchers use paleomagnetic directions, matching mountain belts, rock ages, and isotope patterns to reconstruct proposed supercontinents. Nuna, also called Columbia in some reconstructions, assembled and later broke apart. Rho Din Ea followed much later. Their outlines remain uncertain because many margins were reused or destroyed. A supercontinent is not simply a modern map with the names removed. Blocks can be rotated, partly submerged, or joined along boundaries later, hidden by younger events. Reconstructions often agree on some neighbors and dispute others. The evidence allows broad stories of assembly and breakup without supplying a satellite image from 1 billion years ago. These movements affected life indirectly and repeatedly. Continental collision raised mountain belts. Weathering carried dissolved material and sediment toward seas. Rifting created basins, volcanic activity, and long new shorelines. Nutrient supply changed as rivers reached different rocks. Ocean circulation responded to changing connections. Carbon dioxide moved among atmosphere, ocean, sediments, and mantle through processes operating on different timescales. The workings of tectonics also continued to evolve. Earlier local subduction-like behavior may have preceded a fully connected modern plate system. By later Proterozoic time, cycles of assembly and breakup are clearer, though the precise positions of every block are not. It is enough to know that geography was active. Long-lived microbial and eukaryotic communities did not inhabit one static global aquarium. Some older histories called much of the Proterozoic the boring billion. The phrase points to stretches with less obvious change in certain isotope records, but it easily becomes misleading. During those intervals, eukaryotic branches diversified, ecological interactions developed, continental blocks shifted, and ocean chemistry remained layered. The absence of dinosaurs is not the absence of events. It is merely a hardship for illustrations. Fossil evidence for early eukaryotes can be difficult to assign. Large cells, ornamented walls, and patterns of division may distinguish them from bacteria, but form does not always reveal close relationship. Biomarkers are vulnerable to contamination and may be made by more groups than once thought. Molecular clocks depend on models and fossil calibration. The sensible result is a range of evidence, not one birthday for the eukaryotic cell. Later Proterozoic rocks preserve more signs of multicellular life. Algae occupied marine settings. Organisms grew in sheets, filaments, and more complex forms. Oxygen conditions changed through space and time, and nutrient availability may have limited productivity in some oceans. Biological innovation therefore occurred within environments that could be rich near the surface and restrictive below. Din Ea's breakup altered those environments. Rifting and volcanism changed continental shapes. Smaller land masses and new margins exposed rock to weathering. Carbon drawn down through weathering can reduce greenhouse warming over long periods, though the actual climate depends on volcanic supply, geography, ocean circulation, and the brightness of the sun. Near the beginning of the Cryo-Eon period, these influences met powerful feedback from ice. Ice reflects more incoming sunlight than dark water or rock. As glaciers spread, the planet could absorb less energy and cool further, allowing ice to spread again. This ice albedo feedback made extensive glaciation physically possible once conditions crossed a threshold. Evidence later found in Namibia, South Australia, and other regions suggested that glaciers reached places lying near ancient tropical latitudes. That evidence created a striking problem. If ice approached the equator, how completely did it cover the oceans, and how did life persist? Models range from thick, nearly global sea ice to arrangements with thinner ice or open water refuges. The surviving rocks do not demand one exact frozen surface. They do show that the quiet-looking Proterozoic was capable of climate changes on a planetary scale. Glacial deposits near ancient tropical latitudes were difficult to fit into an ordinary ice age. Rocks carried scratches and sediments associated with moving ice, while magnetic evidence placed some of them surprisingly close to the equator. The Cryo-Eon period, from about 720 million to 635 million years ago, contains at least two great glacial intervals known as the Stur-T-Un and Ma-Rin-O-Un. The phrase Snowball Earth captures the scale of the hypothesis, but it can imply more precision than the evidence provides. A hard snowball model covers the ocean almost completely with ice. Other models permit belts of open water, thin tropical ice, seasonal openings, or slushy regions. Glaciers on land and low-latitude deposits are well supported. The thickness and continuity of sea ice, the locations of refuges, and conditions beneath the ice remain debated. Ice albedo feedback supplies the central physical engine. Expanding ice reflected sunlight, reducing absorbed heat and encouraging further cooling. Continental position influenced where weathering occurred and how currents moved. Declining greenhouse gases could push climate toward a threshold. Once extensive ice took hold, the feedback could carry it far beyond the usual polar regions. The same system contained a possible route out. If broad ice cover and cold conditions slowed chemical weathering, volcanic carbon dioxide could continue entering the atmosphere without being removed as efficiently. Over a very long interval, greenhouse warming could build until melting began. As dark water or land reappeared, it absorbed more sunlight, reversing the ice feedback. This broad mechanism is plausible, though volcanic carbon does not explain every local deposit, duration, or chemical change by itself. Rocks immediately above glacial layers often include cap carbonates. These unusual carbonate deposits indicate sharply altered ocean and atmospheric conditions during deglaciation. Iron formations also reappeared in some cryogen-eon successions, suggesting changes in ocean mixing and redox chemistry. Weathering of newly exposed surfaces could send large pulses of dissolved material toward the sea. For life, the glaciations were not a blank interval. Microbes and eukaryotes persisted. Possible refuges included open water, thin ice that admitted light, hydrothermal environments, and waters along margins or beneath floating ice. Different organisms needed different conditions, so survival probably did not have one universal solution. The fossil and molecular records show continuity across the period, even when they do not identify the shelter used by each lineage. The duration of the major glaciations added to the challenge. These were not seasonal winters or the waxing and waning ice sheets of the recent geological past. They operated under different continental arrangements, solar brightness, atmospheric chemistry, and biological conditions. Comparing them casually with the Pleistocene hides more than it explains. As ice retreated, high weathering rates and unusual ocean chemistry may have affected nutrients and productivity. Oxygen conditions continued to vary. Climate did not settle instantly into a gentle, uniform state. Yet the interval after the Ma-Rin-O unglaciation led into the Ed-Ak-A-Run period, when large bodies and complex traces became increasingly visible in the fossil record. The first impression of that record is often literal. At Mistaken Point in Newfoundland, volcanic ash buried communities on a deep seafloor. Their bodies left impressions that later emerged on exposed rock surfaces. Similar broad chapters appear in the White Sea region, Namibia, and the Ediacara Hills of South Australia. Though the assemblages differ in age, habitat, and preservation, this difference matters. Ed-Ak-A-Run life was not one community spread unchanged around the world. Some assemblages contain frond-like forms attached to the bottom. Others include quilted bodies, mobile traces, or early skeletal organisms. Changes through the period may reflect biological evolution, ecology, environmental shifts, and the varying ways sediment captured soft forms. The end of extreme glaciation did not cause animals to appear in one simple step. Eukaryotic and multicellular histories were already old. Oxygen and nutrient conditions could influence size and activity, while genetic and ecological innovations unfolded within lineages. A thaw can change opportunities without writing a biological script. The most useful consequence of Snowball Earth is therefore not a dramatic claim that ice nearly ended life and then created animals. It is the recognition that climate, rock weathering, ocean chemistry, and biology were tightly linked. The cryogen-eon rocks record a system crossing thresholds and recovering under conditions still imperfectly known. Above the glacial deposits, and cap carbonates, the archive becomes populated by shapes unlike most later organisms. Some resemble leaves, but did not grow as plants in sunlight. Some look quilted, segmented, or branching. Their relationships cannot be read from appearance alone. The ice had left behind a changed ocean, and those oceans preserved entire communities as quiet shadows in stone. The shadows at Mistaken Point belong to organisms that lived too deep for photosynthesis. Many were rain geomorphs, bodies built from repeated branching units, arranged into larger branches and fronds. They stood or lay above microbial seafloors, perhaps absorbing nutrients or interacting with currents in ways still uncertain. Their resemblance to fern leaves is superficial. No sunlight reached their habitat, and their place among living groups remains unclear. Ed-Ac-A-Run preservation encourages humility because soft bodies usually vanish. At Mistaken Point, ash settled over communities and captured external forms. In South Australia and the White Sea region, sand and microbial mats created other styles of impressions. Namibia preserves later assemblages with more skeletal forms. Each setting filters what can be seen. A fossil community is therefore both an ancient ecosystem and the result of a particular burial process. Dickinsonia is among the best known Ed-Ac-A-Run forms. Its broad body carried repeated rib-like units and left quilted impressions. Some surfaces preserve traces that may record movement and feeding across microbial mats. Chemical evidence from certain specimens has supported an animal relationship, but Ed-Ac-A-Run organisms must be considered one by one. A useful clue for Dickinsonia does not classify every frond or disc beside it. The seafloor itself was different from many later marine bottoms. Microbial mats could spread broadly where animals did not yet churn sediment deeply. Organisms rested on them, fed across them, or anchored within them. Trace fossils show movement and interaction even when the bodies that made the traces are absent. Later in the Ed-Ac-A-Run, burrows became more complex and penetrated farther into sediment. This change in behavior mattered to chemistry. Burrowing moves oxygenated water and organic material through the seafloor. It disturbs layers, opens small habitats, and changes which minerals form. A track or burrow can therefore record an animal's motion and a broader ecological transformation. The body fossil supplies shape. The trace supplies activity. No single Ed-Ac-A-Run scene should be stretched across the whole period, which lasted almost 100 million years. The oldest large communities at Mistaken Point differ from younger White Sea assemblages, where mobility and probable animals are clearer. Nama assemblages include skeletal forms and communities living under changing environmental conditions. Geography also mattered. Newfoundland, Russia, Namibia, and Australia occupied very different positions from their modern ones. The disappearance of many characteristic forms near the end of the period has several possible explanations. Oxygen and ocean chemistry changed. New animals disturbed microbial mats and altered habitats. Ecological competition may have mattered. Preservation itself changed as substrates and burrowing changed. Some lineages may have ended, while others may have relatives among later animals. The evidence does not support bundling every unusual form into one failed experiment swept aside by superior Cambrian life. Evolution has no obligation to preserve familiar designs. An organism can thrive for millions of years and leave no living descendants. Another can persist in modified descendants whose connection is hard to recognize. Success, measured by resemblance to the present, would make most of Earth history look unnecessarily unsuccessful. Toward the close of the Ed-Ac-A run, small skeletal parts appeared in some settings. Burrows became more elaborate. Predation may be recorded in damaged shells and other interactions. These changes have roots before the formal Cambrian boundary. When later seas seem to fill suddenly with animals, part of the effect comes from harder bodies and more active traces becoming easier to preserve. The formal base of the Cambrian is placed at about 538,800,000 years ago. A boundary on the geological time scale is a reference point agreed through physical strata and correlation. It does not require every ecosystem to transform at the same instant. The date can be refined while the rocks retain their order. Across that boundary, sediment became more thoroughly disturbed by burrowing. Skeletons made calcium carbonate, phosphate, or other resistant materials. Eyes and active movement changed interactions. Predators, grazers, filter feeders, scavengers, and deposit feeders opened ecological possibilities. Developmental systems inherited from earlier animals could produce new forms as environments and interactions changed. Ordinary fossil deposits still selected heavily for hard material. A shell or mineralized joint had a better chance of burial and survival than a soft internal organ. This creates the impression that the early Cambrian world was made largely of pieces sturdy enough for a museum drawer. Exceptional deposits would correct that impression. In the Canadian Rockies and at sites in China, fine sediment preserved soft anatomy along with harder parts. These deposits reveal animals that fit no simple modern category, as well as early relatives of familiar groups. The change from Ed-Ac-A run impressions to Cambrian abundance was real, but the archive itself had also changed. Its newly crowded pages recorded both biological diversification and a much more revealing way of becoming a fossil. The exceptional pages of the Cambrian archive are thin layers of shale. At the Burgess Shale in the Canadian Rockies, fine sediment buried marine organisms quickly enough to preserve outlines and carbon films of soft tissues. Chengji N-type deposits in China provide another early view. Together with newer sites such as Marble Canyon, they expose ecosystems that an ordinary collection of shells would have reduced almost beyond recognition. Some animals had mineralized parts and can be followed widely. Trilobites, for example, were marine arthropods with jointed bodies and hard external skeletons. They occupied many feeding roles, molted as they grew, and often possessed calcite lenses in compound eyes. They were not one standard Cambrian creature. Their diverse lineages continued until the end of the Permian, far beyond the interval with which they are most strongly associated. Soft-bodied organisms reveal a wider range of anatomy. Limbs, gills, digestive tracts, eyes, spines, and feeding structures make ecological relationships easier to infer. Some forms belong near the early branches of living groups. Others combine features in ways no living animal does. They are not jokes made by evolution before it became serious. They are parts of a branching history from which only some branches survive. The Cambrian explosion unfolded over tens of millions of years. Explosion is a geological description of relatively rapid diversification, not a literal instant. A run animals and traces preceded it. During the Cambrian, body forms became more disparate and ecosystems more structured, while skeletonization and exceptional preservation made the change unusually visible. Several explanations operate together. Oxygen may have permitted more active metabolisms in certain habitats. Nutrient supply and ocean chemistry shaped productivity. Developmental genes allowed bodies to be patterned in varied ways, though the genes did not suddenly appear with a plan for every later animal. Predation favored armor, mobility, detection, and new feeding strategies. Animals changing the seafloor created further niches. Burrowing was especially consequential. Earlier microbial mats had stabilized broad surfaces. Animals began mixing sediment, drawing oxygenated water downward, and moving buried nutrients upward. This agronomic revolution altered the physical habitat. It also made some old styles of preservation rarer. A more active seafloor could be biologically rich, while becoming less willing to retain a clean body impression. Eyes changed the range at which organisms could respond to one another. Hard parts offered support, defense, and leverage. Jointed limbs allowed precise movement. Predation created feedback, but the common image of one universal arms race is too simple. Animals also filtered water, grazed mats, gathered particles, and moved through sediment. Ecology expanded by cooperation, engineering, and ordinary feeding, as well as pursuit. The fossil record records this expansion unevenly. Hard parts are more likely to survive. Lowland marine basins preserve more sediment than eroding uplands. Abundant organisms are found more easily than rare ones. Old rocks have more time to be heated, buried, and destroyed. A lineage's first known fossil is therefore a minimum age, not the moment it came into being. Marble Canyon widened the known Burgess Shale world by preserving dozens of taxa, including forms previously known from other localities. Such discoveries change geographic ranges and show how much depends on finding the right exposure. A species absent from one quarry may have lived elsewhere, or may simply have missed the exact burial conditions needed for preservation. By later Cambrian time, marine communities occupied shelves and basins across continental blocks, unlike the modern continents. Their geography shaped currents and shallow habitat. The broad diversification continued into the Ordovician, when plankton, reefs, and many seafloor groups expanded dramatically. The Cambrian was an opening of ecological space, not the final assembly of modern seas. Nor was life confined forever to water. Microbial films already occupied damp terrestrial settings. Fungi and plant-like organisms had begun using exposed surfaces. The evidence on land is modest because early colonists were small and uplands erode. Tiny spores preserve more readily than delicate bodies. These spores would become the next unusual archive. Cryptospores appear before abundant fossils of vascular plants. Their resistant walls traveled into sediments and survived long enough to record reproductive cycles on land. Later trilete spores, marked by the way groups of 4 cells separated, trace further plant diversification. The movement onto land did not resemble a green wave crossing bare continents in one season. Microbes, fungi, arthropods, and plants established themselves in overlapping stages. Each altered surfaces and soils. The bustling Cambrian Sea had become easier to see because bodies and burial changed. The first terrestrial ecosystems remained difficult to see because their most revealing evidence could fit in a pinch of sediment. Tiny spores carried a large implication. Plants or close relatives were reproducing on land before stems, leaves, and roots became common fossils. They occupied wet margins and low surfaces where water remained available. Fungal partnerships probably helped some early plants obtain mineral nutrients, though the timing and form of those relationships varied. There was no single landing party. Meanwhile, Ordovician seas continued the diversification begun in the Cambrian. Reef communities changed. Plankton became more varied. Brachiopods, mollusks, echinoderms, and other groups spread through shallow marine habitats. Continents were arranged largely in the southern hemisphere, with high sea levels covering broad continental shelves. Near the end of the Ordovician, environmental changes reduced that habitat in more than one pulse. Cooling built ice on Gondwana, the great southern continental region. Sea level fell as water accumulated in ice, draining portions of shallow seas. Later warming and ice retreat altered circulation and contributed to oxygen stress. Volcanic nutrient delivery, productivity, carbon burial, and climate have all entered causal models. The extinction was severe, but it did not follow one simple sequence everywhere. Recovery occurred within changed oceans. On land, the sparse cover continued to develop. Early vascular tissue allowed water and nutrients to move more effectively through plant bodies. Stems could grow taller. Leaves evolved in several forms. Root-like structures became true roots in different lineages. Each feature had its own history, rather than arriving as a packaged terrestrial plant. Roots changed more than plants. They entered cracks, stabilized sediment, and interacted with fungi and microbes. Acids released around roots helped weather minerals. Organic matter entered developing soils. Rivers that had once spread broad sheets of shifting sediment increasingly encountered stable banks and debris. Channels became more complex as vegetation held some surfaces in place. Arthropods also occupied land. Their external skeletons and jointed legs suited movement across firm surfaces, while water loss and reproduction posed new demands. Millipede-like animals, arachnid relatives, and later insects entered terrestrial food webs. They fed on plant material, fungi, microbes, and one another. The history is preserved in bodies, tracks, burrows, and pieces of resistant cuticle. By the Devonian, plants included forests. Some early trees belonged to lineages, unlike modern forest dominance. They developed wood and extensive roots through different anatomical solutions. Their canopies changed light and moisture near the ground. Fallen material added carbon to soil and water. Roots reached deeper rock and increased chemical weathering. These processes affected the wider Earth system. Weathering consumes carbon dioxide over long time scales when dissolved products eventually become carbonate sediments. Nutrients entering rivers can increase biological productivity, while decay in poorly circulated water can consume oxygen. Plant burial stores carbon. The rise of forests therefore influenced atmosphere and ocean without acting as one simple thermostat. Devonian rivers became habitats shaped by this new vegetation. Floodplains held woody debris. Channels developed banks and bends. Shallow waters could be warm, crowded with plants, and seasonally variable. Fishes diversified in these settings and in the sea. Jawed fishes included armored forms, sharks and their relatives, ray-finned fishes, and lobe-finned groups with robust internal bones. Lobe-finned anatomy would later be important because the limbs of tetrapods share a deep structural history with fins in this branch. That does not mean one fish decided to leave water. Shallow habitats rewarded many traits. Lifting the head, supporting the body against the bottom, maneuvering among plants, and breathing air where water oxygen was low. The transition can be reconstructed through multiple fossils. Some retained fully aquatic lives, but had limb bone patterns. Others possessed digits, while still spending much of their time in water. Features appeared in a mosaic. A mobile neck did not require a land animal. A strong rib cage could aid support or breathing in shallow water. Digits did not instantly produce a walker crossing dry plains. To find one particularly revealing fossil, researchers looked not merely for exposed rock, but for rock of the right age and former environment. Geological maps pointed toward late Devonian sediments in Arctic Canada that had once formed in shallow channels and floodplains. The search was a prediction. If an intermediate relative had lived in such a setting, these rocks might preserve it. What emerged was Tiktaalik, a flattened animal with scales and fin rays, yet also a mobile neck, broad ribs, and internal fin joints capable of bearing weight. Its discovery did not supply the ancestor of every later land vertebrate. It supplied something more useful, evidence that a particular combination of features existed at a particular time in the very habitat where evolutionary reasoning suggested it might be found. Tiktaalik lived in shallow water, not at the head of a ceremonial march onto land. Its eyes sat high on a flattened skull. Unlike most fishes, its head could move separately from the shoulder region. Inside each front fin were bones corresponding broadly to an upper arm, forearm, and a flexible wrist-like joint, while fin rays still formed the outer edge. The structure could support the body against a bottom or in very shallow water. Robust ribs may have helped brace the trunk and assist breathing. A combination of gills and air-breathing ability is plausible among such fishes, though soft organs are rarely available. The important point is mosaic anatomy. Fish traits and tetrapod-like traits coexisted because the categories used later do not dictate how evolution must arrange features. Other Devonian relatives add different combinations. Some early tetrapods possessed digits, yet remained strongly aquatic, with tails and limbs suited to water. Track evidence can also reveal weight-bearing or movement where body fossils are absent. The transition from finned vertebrates to tetrapods was a branching radiation through shorelines, channels, floodplains, and wetlands. Land itself had already been occupied by microbes, fungi, plants, and arthropods. Vertebrates entered existing ecosystems. Early excursions might have involved movement between pools, feeding in shallows, avoiding aquatic competitors, or resting in vegetation. No one pressure needs to account for every feature or lineage. The same Devonian forests that reshaped rivers may also have affected marine environments. Deeper roots and expanded weathering delivered nutrients toward seas. Greater productivity could increase organic burial, but decay could remove oxygen from water. These links are studied as possible contributors to late Devonian crises, alongside volcanism, climate change, sea level movement, and circulation. There was not one late Devonian extinction day. The Kellwasser events occurred near the boundary between the Fraz, Ni-Un, and Fa-Men, I-Un stages. They strongly affected reefs and many marine groups. Later, near the Devonian Carboniferous boundary, the Hangenberg event brought another distinct interval of change. Separating them prevents a long, uneven history from being pressed into the familiar shape of a single impact. Black shales in many basins record oxygen-poor bottom waters and the preservation of organic matter. Some settings became euxinic, meaning both oxygen-free and rich in sulfide. The pattern differed among basins and depths. Carbon isotope shifts, sediment chemistry, fossil losses, and dated volcanic layers help align the changes. But their causes remain a network rather than one settled trigger. Reef ecosystems suffered especially. Reef building had been extensive earlier in the Devonian, carried by corals and sponges of forms different from many modern reef builders. Their decline altered shallow marine habitats. Fishes also experienced turnover, while some groups persisted and diversified later. On land, plant communities and tetrapod relatives continued through the disruptions. Extinction is selective. A change that removes shallow habitat affects organisms tied to shelves differently from those in deep or freshwater settings. Low oxygen harms some metabolisms and life stages more than others. Climate and acidity vary regionally. Fossil preservation then adds another filter. This is why a single percentage can conceal more than it reveals. By the beginning of the Carboniferous, surviving tetrapod lineages occupied an increasing range of wet terrestrial habitats. Limbs became more effective for movement on land in some branches. Feeding structures, vertebral columns, and senses changed. Yet reproduction still tied many forms closely to water, where exposed eggs and aquatic young developed. Plants expanded into vast equatorial wetlands. Different basins held forests of lycopsids, seed ferns, horsetail relatives, and other groups. Waterlogged ground slowed complete decay. Plant material accumulated as peat, later buried, and chemically altered into coal. The seam left behind is not merely fuel. It is a compressed record of growth, flooding, burial, and basin history. These wetlands coexisted with ice on Gondwana and with drier regions elsewhere. Carboniferous does not mean one endless humid forest covering Earth. Climate shifted as continents moved and carbon cycled. Forest habitats fragmented in some regions, changing tetrapod distribution and favoring lineages able to move among drier settings. One reproductive innovation became especially useful there. Membranes around an embryo managed water, waste, gas exchange, and nourishment more independently of an exposed aquatic egg. The amniotic arrangement evolved through stages and would support two broad histories: the synapsid line containing mammals and the reptile line containing many other familiar land vertebrates. It began quietly among the leaf litter and wetland margins, while future coal gathered beneath them. The leaf litter and wet ground accumulated faster than all of it could decay. Floods buried peat beneath sediment. Pressure, heat, and chemical change gradually transformed that plant material into coal. Different coal basins preserve different plant communities and ages. None required a dinosaur. Coal forests largely preceded dinosaurs, a scheduling detail that has inconvenienced a durable popular myth. The forests were unlike most modern ones. Tall lycopsids carried scale-like bark patterns. Horsetail relatives grew to tree size. Seed ferns and early seed plants occupied varied settings. Fungi and microbes broke down tissues, though some plant compounds and waterlogged conditions resisted rapid decay. Repeated subsidence allowed thick sequences of peat and sediment to build. Atmospheric oxygen was often high during parts of the Carboniferous, partly connected to organic carbon burial. Some arthropods reached remarkable sizes. Oxygen may have eased the movement of gas through their respiratory systems, but temperature, ecology, development, and other constraints also mattered. Oxygen levels changed through the period, and not every large arthropod was produced by one atmospheric dial. Far to the south, Gondwanan ice sheets advanced and retreated. The assembly of continents, uplift and weathering, carbon burial, and orbital variations influenced the late Paleozoic Ice Age. Equatorial coal swamp and southern glacier belonged to the same planet. Deep time repeatedly resists a single background painting. Around 307 million years ago, rainforest fragmentation changed broad habitats in Euramerica. Drier intervals divided wet forests into patches. Tetrapod communities changed in response. Some lineages remained associated with water, while others ranged through drier ground. Fragmentation did not end every forest, but it altered the geography of survival and dispersal. Amniotic reproduction reduced dependence on open water. Several membranes surrounded and supported the embryo, handling nourishment, waste, protection, and gas exchange. The early condition need not have resembled a hard modern bird egg. Soft coverings and varied nesting settings were possible. Evolution assembled the system through modifications of structures already present in vertebrate embryos. The oldest familiar amniote body fossils come from late Carboniferous deposits, but trackways may push the history deeper. Tracks reveal feet and motion without preserving the animal itself. New finds can therefore change estimates even when no skeleton accompanies them. Crown groups, stem relatives, and the exact maker of a print complicate any claim to possess the first amniote. The broad amniote family divided into synapsid and reptiline branches early. Synapsids are identified through skull structure and other anatomy. They include early forms once loosely called mammal-like reptiles, later therapsids and cynodonts, and mammals. The old label is misleading because synapsids were not reptiles trying to become something better. They followed their own diverse history. Reptiline amniotes also diversified widely. Later branches would include turtles, lizards, crocodile relatives, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and birds, though their relationships unfolded over hundreds of millions of years. Early members were generally modest animals sharing landscapes with amphibian-grade tetrapods and numerous other lineages. As the Carboniferous ended and the Permian began, continental collision assembled Pangaea. Mountain belts rose where land masses met. A vast connected continent changed monsoons, ocean circulation, and the reach of dry interiors. Pangaea was not uniformly desert. River systems, temperate forests, wetlands, arid basins, and cold southern regions existed according to latitude and topography. Coal-forming environments declined in some regions as climate and basins changed. Gondwanan glaciation waned over the Permian. Seed plants, better suited to seasonal dryness, spread. Tetrapod communities reorganized. Synapsids included large herbivores and predators, along with smaller forms. Traits associated with mammals appeared in pieces across later synapsid branches. Teeth became more differentiated for distinct jobs. Limb posture changed in some groups. Jaw bones altered, while structures involved in hearing evolved. Patterns of growth and metabolism shifted. No Permian animal carried a complete modern mammal package, and no branch knew which descendants would persist. Evolution worked with inherited anatomy under immediate conditions. Near the end of the Permian, the broad continental arrangement magnified environmental connections. Huge volcanic activity began in Siberia. Lava spread at the surface, creating stepped basalt terrain later called the Siberian Traps. More consequentially, magma entered underground sediments as sheets called sills. Some of those sediments were rich in organic matter, coal, carbonates, salts, and other materials capable of releasing gases when heated. The quiet coal seam and the underground sill now belonged to one process. Carbon stored through ancient plant growth could return rapidly to the atmosphere when invaded by magma. The result would not be a single explosion, but a sustained disturbance moving among rock, air, ocean, and climate. Pangaea's varied inhabitants were approaching the most severe known extinction of the Phanerozoic Eon. The Phanerozoic is the eon of abundant visible life, beginning with the Cambrian and continuing to the present. Its most severe known biotic crisis arrived near the end of the Permian, about 252 million years ago. The crisis was not one blast or one dreadful afternoon. High-precision dates connect extinction intervals with immense magmatism, whose effects moved through the Earth system over longer spans. At the surface, flood basalts covered enormous areas of Siberia in repeated eruptions. Underground, magma forced its way between layers of sediment. These sills heated organic-rich rocks, coal, carbonates, and evaporites. Carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur compounds, and other volatiles could be released from both magma and heated sediments. The location of the intrusions, therefore, mattered as much as the volume of lava. Carbon isotope changes record a major disturbance to the carbon cycle. Rapid greenhouse gas addition warmed climate. Warmer ocean water held less oxygen, while circulation and nutrient cycling changed. Acidification placed additional pressure on organisms building shells and skeletons. On land, heat, aridity, rainfall changes, and chemical stress affected vegetation and soils. No single mechanism operated in isolation. Pangaea's geography shaped these effects. Vast interiors were distant from moisture carried off the oceans, but coasts and higher latitudes differed. Seasonal monsoons moved around the supercontinent. The surrounding ocean and the eastern Tethys realm contained shelves, reefs, deep basins, and restricted seas. Environmental stress, therefore, arrived with different timing and strength across habitats. Marine fossil records show profound loss and ecological reorganization. Reef systems largely disappeared. Many brachiopod, mollusk, echinoderm, and plankton lineages ended, while others survived in reduced ranges. On land, vertebrate and insect records have different completeness. Plants show regional turnover rather than one universal horizon. This is why familiar claims that one exact percentage of all species vanished should be handled cautiously. Estimates depend on whether the count concerns species, genera, a region, or a habitat. Synapsids were among the terrestrial lineages affected. Earlier Permian communities had contained many forms, including large herbivores and predators. Some therapsid branches survived the boundary, though ecosystems were drastically reduced and reorganized. Their later descendants would include cynodonts and mammals, but survival did not amount to a reserved place in the future. Recovery took millions of years and varied by setting. Some organisms became common in disturbed environments and are sometimes called disaster taxa. The label describes abundance under unusual conditions, not badly designed life. Simple food webs and unstable climate could persist before more complex communities returned. Reefs recovered on their own schedules. Terrestrial vegetation and soils followed regional histories. The early Triassic retained strong carbon cycle fluctuations. Heat and low marine oxygen remained important in some intervals. Fresh eruptions, weathering, and the gradual burial of carbon influenced the return toward more stable conditions. Ecological space was open, but it was not empty. Survivors, migrants, and newly diversifying lineages encountered one another across recovering basins. This slow aftermath distinguishes the end Permian crisis from the impact that would close the Cretaceous. Both were global disruptions, but their physical triggers, time scales, and environmental sequences differed. The Permian story begins with a vast igneous province, and especially with magma entering volatile-rich sediments. It does not need a crater, a darkened single season, or a borrowed plot. By the Middle and Late Triassic, marine ecosystems included new reef builders, mollusks, fishes, and marine reptiles. On land, archosaurs diversified. That broad group contains crocodile-line forms, as well as the lineage, leading to pterosaurs and dinosaurs. Large amphibians persisted in many wet environments. Synapsid survivors included herbivores and increasingly mammal-like cynodonts. Early dinosaurs were only one portion of these communities. Their first appearances are difficult to define because fragmentary fossils may lie just inside or outside Dinosauria. Asasaurus, known from incomplete Middle Triassic material in Tanzania, may be an early dinosaur or a close sister lineage. The uncertainty is more informative than a forced coronation of the first dinosaur. More secure, diverse dinosaurs appear later in Triassic rocks, including those of Argentina. They were initially accompanied by many other archosaurs and synapsids. Their eventual ecological prominence developed through environmental change, extinction, opportunity, and diversification. Nothing in the Permian extinction cleared a stage expressly for them. The supercontinent also began to fracture. Rifting opened basins that would later become parts of the Atlantic. Magma rose through the stretched crust as recovery gave way to new Triassic ecosystems. Climate and rainfall would shift sharply again during the Cambrian, and dinosaurs would become more visible in the record without ever becoming inevitable. The Cambrian pluvial episode brought wetter conditions to many regions around 234 to 232 million years ago. Sediments in the Italian Dolomites and other areas record changes in rainfall, erosion, vegetation, and marine environments. Dinosaur fossils and tracks become more varied around this interval in several records, but correlation does not appoint rainfall as the sole cause of their diversification. Regional sampling matters. Some formations preserve river channels and floodplains well, while others contain gaps. Tracks may show an animal's presence where bones are absent. A rise in known fossils can reflect ecological spread, better preservation, greater abundance, or all three. The Cambrian record still supports a period of substantial environmental and biological change. Dinosaurs belonged within the archosaurs. Their hips, ankles, limbs, and other skeletal features distinguish them, though incomplete early specimens make boundaries uncertain. Early forms included small meat-eaters and plant-eaters, often moving on two legs. Crocodile-line archosaurs included armored and large-bodied animals, occupying roles later popularly assigned only to dinosaurs. Pterosaurs also emerged within the archosaur radiation. They were flying relatives, not dinosaurs. Their wings were membranes supported chiefly by an elongated finger. In the seas lived ichthyosaurs and other marine reptiles, which were not dinosaurs either. The Mesozoic was crowded with related groups that later museum labels have had to separate after popular memory cheerfully mixed them together. Mammal history was developing at the same time. Cynodonts within the synapsid lineage showed continuing changes in teeth, jaws, posture, and growth. Bones that had once formed part of the lower jaw became reduced and increasingly associated with hearing. The main jaw joint shifted. This transformation appears through a sequence of related forms rather than one first creature with every modern mammalian trait. Small body size did not mean ecological insignificance. Later Mesozoic mammaliaforms would dig, climb, swim, glide, and feed in varied ways. In the Triassic, early members occupied insect-eating and other small animal niches, alongside numerous reptile and amphibian lineages. Mammals did not wait underground for an asteroid to grant permission to exist. Pangaea's rifting continued. Crust stretched through what would become the Central Atlantic region. Near the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, enormous volcanism of the Central Atlantic magmatic province accompanied the opening process. Carbon release and climate disturbance coincided with another extinction that affected marine and terrestrial groups. Once again, recovery was selective. Several crocodile-line archosaurs declined, while dinosaurs expanded into ecological space during the Jurassic. This expansion did not erase every competitor. Turtles, crocodilian relatives, pterosaurs, marine reptiles, amphibians, insects, and mammaliaforms remained part of Mesozoic ecosystems. The breakup of Pangaea was gradual. Rifts became narrow seas, and some seas became ocean basins. Coastlines lengthened. Populations that had once exchanged across continuous land became separated. Currents changed as gateways opened. Volcanism created new terrain. Mountain belts and interior basins developed along changing margins. Jurassic climate was generally warm, but varied by latitude, season, and region. Conifers, cycads, ferns, and other plants formed vegetation before flowering plants became widespread. Sauropod dinosaurs reached immense sizes in some environments. Their long necks and columnar limbs supported feeding strategies, unlike those of smaller herbivores. Theropods ranged from small feathered forms to large predators. Feathers did not begin solely as flight equipment. Filamentous coverings could insulate, display scents, or help cover eggs. More complex veined feathers developed in theropod lineages. Their later use in flight was an evolutionary reuse of structures with earlier functions. Not every feathered dinosaur flew, and not every flying Mesozoic reptile carried feathers of the avian kind. Small theropods close to the origin of birds combined grasping limbs, light skeletons, feathers, and varied movement. In lagoonal limestone of Bavaria, fine sediment preserved one of the most famous mosaics. Archaeopteryx had teeth, clawed fingers, a long bony tail, and broad feathered wings. It was not a modern bird placed awkwardly among reptiles, nor a solitary link joining two otherwise complete chains. Its anatomy belonged within a branching set of feathered dinosaurs. The limestone retained detailed feather impressions. Later analysis of bone geometry would suggest some powered flight, likely in short bouts. And unlike the sustained flight of many living birds, as Pangaea continued to divide, Archaeopteryx occupied islands and lagoons in a world where the distinction between dinosaur and bird had not yet become sharp. The Bavarian limestone preserved asymmetrical flight feathers along Archaeopteryx's arms and tail. Its wing bones could withstand forces compatible with active flapping, though shoulder anatomy and flight style differed from those of many modern birds. Short flights among islands, trees, or low vegetation are plausible. The fossil records capacity, not a complete itinerary. Other feathered theropods reveal that avian features appeared in varied combinations. Some had long tail feathers used in display. Some bore feathers on arms and legs. Brooding positions connect feathered limbs with egg care. Light bones, air sacs, and changes in the hand and shoulder evolved across branches. Birds emerged from within dinosaurs, which means the dinosaur story never entirely ends. Jurassic seas had their own large reptiles. Ichthyosaurs had streamlined bodies, while plesiosaurs used 4 flippers in forms of underwater flight. Ammonites drifted or swam with coiled shells and became useful fossils for comparing rock ages. None of these marine reptiles was a dinosaur. Their shared era does not make them one group, any more than sharing a railway carriage creates a family. Mammaliaforms remained mostly small, but occupied more roles than the old image of one nocturnal insect eater allows. Some climbed, burrowed, or moved through water. Teeth reveal varied diets. Delicate middle ear structures and jaw arrangements continued to change. Hair and warm-blooded physiology have deeper synapsid roots, though soft tissues and metabolism leave indirect evidence. As the Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous, continental separation increased. The Atlantic widened. India moved as an isolated landmass for part of its journey north. High sea levels later flooded continental interiors, creating broad, shallow seas. Islands and barriers encouraged regional dinosaur faunas, while ocean circulation carried heat around a greenhouse world. Flowering plants became increasingly important during the Cretaceous. Their deeper origin remains debated because molecular estimates, pollen, leaves, and rare possible fossils do not agree perfectly. What is clear is a major radiation in Cretaceous records. A large share of living flowering plant orders traces early diversification to this interval. Flowers did not instantly replace conifers, cycads, ferns, and other vegetation. They spread through existing communities and diversified in partnership and conflict with insects and other animals. Pollen moved by wind or animals. Fruits and seeds created new feeding relationships. Leaves changed litter and soils. Regional floras responded at different rates. Dinosaurs continued to diversify. Horned, armored, duck-billed, long-necked, and varied theropod groups occupied different continents. Birds also diversified, including lineages with teeth and forms adapted to marine settings. Mammals included insect eaters, plant eaters, and small predators. The Cretaceous was not a faded world awaiting extinction. Beneath what is now Western India, enormous Deccan volcanism began before the period ended. Eruptions came in pulses and continued across the boundary. Volcanic gases influenced climate and ocean chemistry, though the magnitude and direction of short-term effects varied with sulfur, carbon dioxide, weathering, and eruption tempo. These eruptions formed a background stress that must be kept separate from the sudden global boundary evidence. That boundary was first made famous by clay. In the late 1970s, physicist Luis Alvarez, geologist Walter Alvarez, and colleagues studied a thin layer at the end of the Cretaceous. They expected iridium from slow cosmic dust to help estimate how long the clay had taken to form. Instead, the concentration was far higher than expected. Iridium is scarce in Earth's crust, but more common in many meteorites. The team proposed that a large extraterrestrial impact had spread the element globally. Their 1980 paper made a testable claim. Boundary layers elsewhere could be measured. Other impact products could be sought. An appropriately aged crater should exist. Over time, researchers found iridium anomalies at many sites. Shocked quartz formed under extreme pressure, glassy spherules from molten material, and widespread ejecta deposits. Geophysics, identified a buried circular structure at Chicxulub beneath the Yucatan region. Drilling recovered shocked and melted rocks. Improved dating aligned the crater closely with the boundary at 66 million years ago. The case became strong not through one dramatic object, but through convergence. Chemistry, mineral physics, sedimentology, geophysics, drilling, and chronology all pointed toward the same event. Volcanism remained real and important, but global ejecta and precise timing identified Chicxulub as the principal extinction trigger. A thin clay layer had turned into a planetary reconstruction. The Chicxulub impact released energy across several timescales. Near the crater, rock melted, fractured, and moved. Ejecta traveled outward. Earthquakes, large waves, and fires affected broad regions. For the global extinction, the longer atmospheric consequences were decisive. Dust, soot, and sulfur aerosols reduced sunlight and cooled the surface sharply. Photosynthesis declined on land and in the upper ocean. Food webs dependent on fresh plant or plankton production lost their base. Acid rain and ocean chemistry changes added stress. These effects did not touch every habitat equally or last for identical periods. Sediments preserve a boundary and an aftermath measured in layers rather than one universal scene. Non-avian dinosaurs disappeared, along with ammonites, pterosaurs, and many marine plankton. Birds survived, so dinosaurs as a whole did not vanish. Mammals, crocodilians, turtles, amphibians, fishes, plants, fungi, and many invertebrates also persisted in varying proportions. Survival followed no single rule. Small size may have helped some animals require less food. Flexible diets could use seeds, insects, carrion, or detritus. Freshwater food webs based partly on decaying material may have been buffered from the immediate collapse in surface photosynthesis. Dormancy, burrowing, broad geographic range, and reproductive strategy could matter. Contingency mattered too. A trait useful in one setting might be irrelevant in another. Plant fossils show severe disruption followed by regional recovery. Fern spores become abundant in some records, a pattern known from disturbed modern ground where ferns colonize rapidly. Seeds and underground tissues could outlast a dark interval. Forest structure returned over time rather than in one global spring. Eruptions continued. High-precision dates place major pulses before and after the boundary. Carbon dioxide could warm climate over longer spans, while sulfur aerosols cooled it more briefly. Volcanism may have influenced late Cretaceous conditions and the character of recovery. Whether the impact changed eruption tempo remains a hypothesis. The evidence hierarchy leaves room for volcanic effects without displacing the crater as trigger. The Paleocene began among reduced and reorganized communities. Mammals were already an old and varied lineage, but surviving branches expanded into newly open roles. Body sizes increased in some groups. Diets diversified. Birds, reptiles, insects, flowering plants, and marine organisms changed alongside them. Recovery was experimentation, not a ceremony installing mammals as rulers. Forests spread across warm regions. Continents continued moving. India approached Asia, and ocean gateways altered circulation. In South America, Antarctica, Australia, and other isolated regions, lineages followed distinct paths. The Paleocene world remained warmer than the modern one and lacked large permanent polar ice sheets. Near 56 million years ago, a large injection of carbon disturbed this warm system. Marine sediments record a pronounced negative carbon isotope excursion, showing that carbon relatively depleted in the heavier isotope entered ocean and atmosphere. Global temperature rose by roughly 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. The interval is called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Ocean acidification affected carbonate preservation. Deep-sea benthic foraminifera experienced substantial extinction. Organisms shifted ranges, and mammal communities changed on land. The amount, source, and exact release rate of carbon remain studied through different archives and age models. The event was rapid in geological terms, though average release rates reconstructed for it are generally unlike the much faster modern addition. It is therefore an imperfect modern analog. Eocene geography, baseline warmth, ecosystems, and absence of large ice sheets created different starting conditions. The thermal maximum demonstrates strong carbon-climate coupling without serving as a precise forecast. Deep time supplies comparisons, not duplicates. Within Eocene ecosystems, whale evolution preserved an especially rich anatomical journey. Their ancestors were terrestrial relatives within the even-toed ungulate branch. Successive fossils record changes in ear bones suited to underwater hearing, nostril position, limbs, spine, and swimming. Oxygen isotopes in teeth can indicate increasing time spent in water. This movement returned a mammal lineage to the sea, but it did not replay the Devonian in reverse. The animals began with weight-bearing limbs, lungs, and mammalian senses. Transitional forms used rivers, coasts, and shallow seas before fully aquatic whales lost functional hind limbs and developed tail-powered swimming. The warm Eocene eventually gave way to a long, uneven cooling. Deep-sea sediment cores would preserve that trend through the oxygen isotopes of tiny shells. Those isotopes carry signals from both water temperature and global ice volume, requiring other evidence for interpretation. The recovering world after Chicxulub had become a world whose climate history could be read from the ocean floor. Tiny shells settling onto the deep ocean floor accumulated into a climate archive. Their oxygen isotope ratios reflected the temperature of the water in which they formed and the amount of lighter oxygen stored in continental ice. Neither signal can be separated casually, so researchers compare additional proxies and regional records. Stacked through time, the shells show a Cenozoic climate that cooled overall, while wandering through warm episodes and abrupt disturbances. Around 34 million years ago, at the Eocene-Oligocene transition, large Antarctic ice sheets began to grow. Declining atmospheric carbon dioxide was central to the change. Ocean gateways, orbital conditions, and the isolation of Antarctica also influenced circulation and climate. No single gateway opening switched the ice on by itself. Antarctic glaciation lowered sea level and changed habitats. Deep ocean circulation reorganized. Marine organisms shifted their ranges, while terrestrial communities responded to cooling and seasonal changes. Ice itself became another part of the climate system, reflecting sunlight and storing water on land. The Oligocene and Miocene were not a steady descent into cold. Warmer intervals interrupted the trend. Mountain ranges rose as plates collided, influencing rainfall and erosion. New ocean connections opened while others narrowed. Kelp forests and productive coastal waters supported changing marine mammals, seabirds, fishes, and invertebrates. Whales diversified into toothed and baleen-bearing lineages. Changes in ocean productivity and circulation affected their food. Some became enormous only much later, when ecological and physical conditions favored bulk filter feeding. Their Eocene return to water had become a broad marine radiation rather than one straight transformation. On land, grasses had evolved long before open grasslands became widespread. A grassland is an ecosystem maintained through rainfall seasonality, soils, grazing, and often fire. It is not merely a forest that failed. Grasses grow from near their base, allowing many to recover after grazing. Their silica-rich tissues and low growth form shaped herbivore teeth and behavior. C4 photosynthesis, a pathway that concentrates carbon dioxide within leaves, became especially useful under certain combinations of warmth, lower carbon dioxide, strong light, and seasonal water stress. C4 grass biomass expanded widely in many lower latitude regions around 8 to 6 million years ago. The timing and cause differed by region. Fire aridity, rainfall seasonality, temperature, and herbivores all contributed. Mammals developed high-crowned teeth in many grazing lineages, though tooth shape can reflect grit and mixed diets, as well as grass. Limbs adapted to movement across open ground in some groups. Burrowers, browsers, predators, and scavengers followed their own ecological changes. Apes diversified in forests and more open mosaics across Africa and Eurasia. Geography changed migration routes. The narrowing seaway between North and South America became increasingly restricted. The Isthmus of Panama is often given one date, but land emergence, shallow water barriers, deep water exchange, and a continuous corridor did not happen simultaneously. Strong final restriction near 2,800,000 years ago is supported, while earlier movement and partial connections also occurred. Plants and animals crossed in both directions during the Great American Biotic Interchange. Some North American groups spread south, while South American lineages moved north. Outcomes depended on climate, habitat, competition, and prior diversity. It was not a contest won by one continent. Ocean circulation also responded as the connection between Pacific and Atlantic waters narrowed. Salinity and current changes may have affected climate, though the isthmus should not be made sole cause of northern hemisphere glaciation. Cooling, carbon dioxide, tectonics, and orbital pacing worked together. By 2,580,000 years ago, the Quaternary period had begun. Large northern hemisphere ice sheets repeatedly advanced and retreated. Variations in Earth's orbit redistributed sunlight by latitude and season. Eccentricity altered the shape of the orbit. Axial tilt changed the strength of seasons, and precession shifted their timing relative to Earth's position around the sun. These cycles paced glaciation, but did not create its full size alone. Ice reflectivity, greenhouse gases, vegetation, dust, and ocean circulation amplified or damped the initial changes. The planet entered repeated glacial and interglacial rhythms. Deep-sea shells would record them across millions of years, while later Antarctic ice would preserve something even more immediate: bubbles of the ancient atmosphere itself. Air trapped between falling snowflakes gradually became sealed inside ice. As more snow accumulated, pressure turned lower layers into compact ice and closed the remaining pores. The bubbles became samples of old atmosphere, though the air is slightly younger than the surrounding ice, and researchers correct for that difference. At Dome C in Antarctica, the record extends carbon dioxide measurements back 800,000 years. Dust, chemical species, and water isotopes accompany the bubbles. Together, they record temperature-related changes, wind, volcanic material, and atmospheric composition across 8 glacial cycles. In that long record, pre-industrial carbon dioxide varied roughly between 172 and 300 parts per million. These are direct measurements of enclosed air, unlike the indirect proxies required for much deeper time. Ocean cores extend the story farther. The record, called the LR04 stack, combines 57 benthic oxygen isotope records distributed around the world. Stacking reduces some local noise and reveals broad changes in ice volume and deep ocean temperature over 5,300,000 years. Earlier Pleistocene cycles followed a strong rhythm near 41,000 years, associated with axial tilt. Later cycles became larger and clustered near roughly 100,000 years. The shift is called the mid-Pleistocene transition. It occurred without a matching new orbital rhythm, showing the importance of internal feedbacks. Ice sheets may have grown thicker as sediment beneath them changed, while carbon dioxide, oceans, and other processes altered the response. Orbital pacing set timing, but Earth decided the volume through its own complicated machinery. The phrase "the Ice Age" compresses these cycles too severely. Glacials alternated with warmer interglacials. Even during glacial maxima, much of the planet remained ice-free. Tropical rainfall patterns, deserts, forests, and coastlines shifted. Southern hemisphere and mountain glaciers followed regional conditions rather than mirroring northern ice sheets exactly. The last glacial maximum was an interval. Global ice volume and major ice sheet extent were greatest broadly, from about 26,500 to 19 or 20,000 years ago. Laurentide ice covered much of northern North America, while Eurasian ice occupied northern Europe and western Siberia. Sea level stood far lower because water was stored on land. Continental shelves emerged. Ba-Rin-Ji-A connected northeastern Asia and northwestern North America across a broad, cold region rather than a narrow bridge. Coastlines lay far from their modern positions. Plants, animals, and human communities occupied habitats now beneath the sea, which leaves a major bias in the archaeological record. Deglaciation unfolded unevenly. Ice sheets retreated, oceans received meltwater, and vegetation ranges moved. Sea level rose in pulses. Ocean circulation changed as fresh water entered the North Atlantic. The young Dryas, beginning about 12,900 years ago, brought sharp cooling, especially around the North Atlantic, before ending about 11,700 years ago. It was not an identical return to full glacial conditions worldwide. Some regions cooled, others changed rainfall, and some continued warming. The event illustrates how a circulation shift can produce strong regional consequences within a global transition. At its close, the formal Holocene epoch began. These climate changes shaped habitats used by hominins, but they did not invent humanity. The earliest possible hominins appeared millions of years before the Quaternary ice cycles. African environments included woodland, forest edges, grasslands, lakes, and shifting mosaics. Climate influenced resources and movement without forcing one anatomical response. Sahelanthropus, at roughly 7 million years old, has a debated position near the early hominin branch. Skull features have been used to discuss head posture and upright movement, but locomotion and relationship remain uncertain. Aurorin and Ardipithecus preserve other combinations. None forms a neat row leading toward the present. Bipedal adaptations appear in pelvis, femur, knee, foot, spine, skull base, and footprints. These features did not all change together. Walking on two legs preceded the large brains of later Homo by millions of years. It may have aided movement and feeding in mixed habitats. But the old story of forests vanishing and forcing one ape onto open savanna is too simple. At Litali, footprints record upright walkers crossing volcanic ash. Australopithecus afarensis is also known from bones, including the partial skeleton called Lucy. Other Australopith species show different faces, teeth, and body proportions. Robust-jawed Paranthropus species followed specialized feeding histories beside early Homo rather than serving as failed attempts. The ice and ocean archives reveal a restless climate. Fossil bones and footprints reveal equally branching responses. On exposed ground, another archive begins, with stones struck hard enough to leave recognizable flakes. long before anyone wrote the maker's name. At Lo Mekwi in Kenya, stones dating to about 3,300,000 years ago bear marks of deliberate pounding and flaking. The assemblage includes cores, flakes, anvils, and percussive pieces. It predates the earliest currently known fossils assigned to Homo. The tools therefore record behavior without identifying a species. Making even a rough stone tool requires choices. A suitable rock must be recognized, held or placed, and struck with enough force at a useful angle. The result may cut, crush, scrape, or process plant and animal material. Archaeologists reconstruct these actions through fracture patterns, where raw material sources and experimental work. One flake does not reveal language or a complete culture, but it preserves a sequence of movement. Alduin tools became widespread from about 2,600,000 years ago. Their makers selected cores and removed sharp flakes through repeated blows. Later, Ashu Li-un traditions included hand axes shaped on two faces. These persisted for more than 1,000,000 years, changing across regions and materials. Their form reflects skill, use, transport, resharpening, and social learning, rather than one frozen mental template. The genus Homo has an uncertain early boundary. Fragmentary, jaw material around 2,800,000 years old is often assigned to early Homo, while Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo erectus overlap in traits and dates. Species names organize variable remains. They do not turn a branching fossil record into a relay race. Homo erectus and related populations had body proportions suited to long-distance walking and occupied varied habitats. By roughly 1,800,000 years ago, populations had dispersed beyond Africa into parts of Eurasia. Technology, diet, social cooperation, and climate flexibility may all have helped. No one adaptation bought a ticket out. Fire evidence requires unusual care. Charcoal can come from wildfire. Burned material can move after combustion. Heat can alter sediment through natural processes. To establish human use, context matters. Location, repeated hearth shape, associated artifacts, microscopic ash, burned bone, and evidence that burning happened where it was found. Wonderwork Cave in South Africa contains microscopic ash and burned bone deep inside the cave in layers, about 1,000,000 years old. Their condition supports in-place burning. This is strong evidence that hominins used fire there. It does not identify the first accidental encounter, first transport of an ember, first habitual control, or first cooking. Those are separate thresholds with different records. Later hearths become clearer and more frequent in some regions. Fire supplied warmth, light, protection, and altered food. It changed the use of caves and camps. It also required fuel, maintenance, and learned practice. Yet populations could differ in how regularly they used it. One discovery does not impose a universal schedule. Human lineages continued to diversify. Neanderthal ancestors occupied Western Eurasia. Other populations lived in eastern Eurasia, Africa, and island Southeast Asia. Fossils are sparse relative to the scale of territory and time. Teeth and fragments may carry enough anatomy for comparison, while leaving body form and behavior uncertain. Around 300,000 years ago, fossils assigned to Homo sapiens appear in Africa. At Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, remains dated to about 315,000 years, with an uncertainty of several tens of thousands of years. Combine faces close to later modern form with more elongated brain cases. Other African fossils preserve different mosaics. The pattern supports emergence through structured, interacting populations across Africa rather than one tiny birthplace waiting to be discovered. Gene flow linked some groups, while distance and changing habitats separated others. Features associated with living humans accumulated through this network. Dispersals beyond Africa also occurred more than once. Earlier Homo populations had already traveled widely. Fossils and artifacts indicate early movements of Homo sapiens into Southwest and East Asia. The principal ancestry of living non-African populations reflects a later expansion around 60 to 50,000 years ago. But this was not the only journey. Coasts, deserts, monsoons, river valleys, and exposed shelves opened and closed routes. Sea crossings reached islands. Material moved between groups through exchange or migration. Genes moved too. When expanding Homo sapiens populations encountered Neanderthals and other humans, the result was not complete isolation, followed by simple replacement. Ancient genomes would eventually preserve encounters that bones alone had left ambiguous. A small fragment from Denisova Cave in Siberia transformed the map of human populations because it retained ancient genetic material. Its genome belonged to a group distinct from both living humans and Neanderthals. The Denisovans had been identified through DNA before their anatomy was known from more than a few remains, a reversal of the usual fossil story. Later genetic work showed a wide and structured Denisovan history. Denisovan-related ancestry is especially substantial in parts of Oceania and also occurs in Asian populations, though exact proportions differ and should not be turned into one global figure. Neanderthal ancestry appears broadly among living non-African populations, again in varying amounts. One individual from Denisova Cave had a Neanderthal mother and Denisovan father. The finding turns abstract interbreeding into a close family fact. These populations retained differences, yet met, and had descendants. Other genomic signals suggest contact with poorly sampled archaic groups, whose bones may not be recognized. Neanderthals themselves occupied varied Eurasian environments. Their tools, food use, mobility, and social practices differed by place and period. They were not a crude rehearsal for Homo sapiens. Denisovans were not one cave population. Species labels are useful, but ancient people did not remain in perfectly sealed boxes. Material evidence for symbolic behavior is similarly scattered. Pigments, beads, engravings, burials, figurative art, musical instruments, and long-distance transport appear at different times and places. Preservation favors stone and bone over fibers, wood, gesture, and speech. There is no archaeological horizon at which imagination switched on everywhere. Language leaves no direct fossil. Anatomy, genetics, tool complexity, and social exchange supply indirect clues, but cannot date one first sentence. Art did not originate once in Europe simply because caves there preserve famous images. African, Asian, Australian, and later American records add distinct histories, while countless works on exposed surfaces or organic materials disappeared. During the last glacial cycles, human communities adapted to coasts, grasslands, forests, deserts, highlands, and cold steppe. Clothing, shelter, storage, exchange, and knowledge of seasonal resources mattered. Lower sea level opened Baringia and other shelves. Rising water later submerged many camps and routes. Large animals disappeared in different patterns across continents and islands during the late Pleistocene. Mammoths survived in some northern regions long after they vanished elsewhere. Australia, the Americas, northern Eurasia, and islands show different timing. Human hunting, habitat change, fire, climate instability, slow reproduction, and existing ecosystem history interacted. Neither climate alone nor one universal human advance explains every loss. On a newly reached island, animals unfamiliar with human hunters may have been vulnerable. On a continent with long hominin presence, rapid climate and vegetation change could combine with hunting pressure. Sparse last dates also make the apparent final moment uncertain. As ice sheets retreated, coastlines moved and plant zones shifted. Communities followed animals, gathered seasonal plants, managed useful stands, burned selected areas, fished, stored food, and returned to favored places. Hunting and gathering were active systems of environmental knowledge, not passive waiting before agriculture. The Holocene began 11,700 years ago under the formal geological scale. It was an interglacial with regional climate variation, not an unchanging mild interval. In several regions, people intensified cultivation and management. Some became more sedentary before relying on domestic crops. Others cultivated while remaining mobile. Domestication was a relationship developing over generations. Harvesting preferences could favor seeds that stayed attached to a plant. Replanting altered the traits represented in the next crop. Herding changed which animals reproduced. Body size, horn shape, age and sex patterns in bones, penning traces, and genetics each preserve part of these changes. The thresholds did not arrive together. Management could precede clear physical domestication. A domesticated species might supplement wild resources rather than support a full farming economy. Settlement could precede agriculture, and mobility could continue alongside cultivation. The phrase Neolithic Revolution is useful only after its many slow local histories are restored. Those histories occurred independently, and through exchange in Southwest Asia, China, New Guinea, Africa, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and lowland South America. The late Pleistocene world of many human populations did not narrow into one route. It opened into communities, tending different plants, animals, soils, and waters, leaving charred seeds and worn tools where genomes had once been the principal guide. Charred seeds preserve choices made during gathering, storage, and cooking. A non-shattering seed head suggests plants increasingly adapted to harvesting, because seeds that remained attached were more likely to be collected and replanted. Changes in seed size or dormancy add other clues. No single trait proves that an entire community had become dependent on farming. In Southwest Asia, people managed cereals, pulses, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs through long overlapping sequences. Cultivation reaches into the 12th millennium before the present, while clear morphological domestication often came later. Dense settlements and storage could develop among communities still using many wild resources. Rice and millet followed distinct histories in China. New Guinea highlands preserve cultivation at Cuck Swamp. African pathways included pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, and varied pastoral systems. Maize developed from teosinte in Mexico. Potatoes, quinoa, and camelids belonged to Andean histories, while manioc, peanuts, fruits, and managed forests shaped lowland South America. These were not isolated inventions, untouched by neighbors. Crops, animals, and techniques moved, while communities adopted, rejected, or altered them. Farming could increase stored food and population, but it could also narrow diets, intensify repetitive labor, spread infections, and create new inequalities. Outcomes depended on ecology, mobility, gender, and political arrangement. Progress and decline are both too simple. Settlement size did not automatically create a city. Jericho had long occupation and monumental features. Cha Tal Hu Yuk had dense housing and elaborate household practices. Whether either counts as the first city depends on criteria such as size, density, administration, regional function, and specialized institutions. The title is less a crown than a disagreement about definitions. At Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, large neighborhoods, workshops, monumental precincts, seals, and accounting practices accompanied urban growth. Proto-cuneiform tablets from roughly 3350 to 3000 before the Common Era recorded administration. Signs developed through established systems of tokens, seals, and notation. Writing was not a moment when pictures naturally improved into letters. The tablets are socially selective. They are rich in commodities, labor measures, and institutional concerns, while ordinary conversation remains absent. Later cuneiform served several languages and genres. Archaeology fills other parts of urban life through food remains, house floors, tools, craft waste, and burials. In Egypt, political integration developed over centuries among Upper and Lower Egyptian centers. Exchange, elite display, ritual warfare, and administration all contributed. The Narmer palette is is a symbolic royal object, not a complete report of one conquest that invented the state. Radiocarbon models and archaeological sequences refine the chronology beyond later king lists. The Indus or Harappan civilization built major centers, including Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and Do-la-Vir'a. Planned streets, drainage, standardized weights, crafts, and long-distance exchange reveal organized urban systems. Its signs remain undeciphered, so claims about language or royal history exceed the evidence. After about 1900 before the Common Era, mature Harappan urban patterns changed as monsoons weakened and river systems shifted. Populations reorganized into different settlements and regions. Cities declined without everyone disappearing. Deurbanization is a political and demographic change, not an empty landscape. At Early Toe in the Yellow River region, roads, palatial compounds, workshops, elite burials, and bronze ritual vessels marked an early second millennium center. Later Chinese traditions describe the Xia dynasty, but identifying Early Toe directly with Xia remains debated. Later Shang oracle bone inscriptions provide a different kind of written evidence. On the Peruvian coast, Caral and other Norte Chico centers built monumental platforms and sunken circular courts by the third millennium before the Common Era. Irrigation linked inland crops with maritime resources, and cotton supported fishing technology. The absence of pottery in this early phase unsettles checklists borrowed from the Old World, but says nothing about the complexity of community life. Mesoamerican societies formed their own towns, ceremonial centers, and states. Olmec material associated with San Lorenzo became influential, yet the label does not describe every Gulf Coast community or a mother culture that simply produced all later traditions. Exchange and regional innovation linked many groups. Metals also moved through networks. Copper, tin, bronze, gold, and later iron involved different sequences of mining, smelting, alloying, casting, and working. A ship such as the one wrecked at Uluburan carried copper and tin ingots across the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, showing scale and connection without proving one universal source. Households, craftspeople, sailors, pastoralists, merchants, migrants, captives, temples, and states all maintained exchange. Writing preserved only some of them. Streets and monuments are visible, but much of civilization consisted of grinding grain, repairing walls, carrying water, tending animals, and negotiating obligations. Those ordinary motions extended networks beyond any single city's archive. The networks grew wider without becoming one seamless world. Metals, crops, technologies, beliefs, languages, and pathogens traveled at different speeds. Empires organized some routes, but households and small communities kept others alive. A cargo of ingots records distant mines and workshops, while a seed found far from its place of domestication records generations of quieter exchange. Before 1492, the Americas contained dense networks of trade, migration, farming, and political life. They had remained biologically separated from Afro-Eurasia, for millennia, apart from limited contacts, such as Norse settlement in Newfoundland. Sustained Atlantic crossings then joined ecosystems that had developed apart. Maize, potatoes, cassava, tomatoes, cacao, and other American crops spread eastward. Wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, pigs, and many weeds moved westward. These transfers changed diets, labor, and land use, but the exchange was not balanced. European colonial expansion carried institutions of conquest, forced relocation, and extraction. Smallpox and other infections contributed to devastating indigenous population loss. Warfare, famine, enslavement, ecological disruption, and colonial policy interacted with disease. Exact continent-wide percentages flatten regional histories and should not substitute for them. Indigenous communities survived, adapted, resisted, and retained sovereignty and cultural continuity. The Atlantic slave trade and other coerced labor systems connected plantations, mines, ports, and markets. People were captured, transported under lethal conditions, and treated as property by legal and economic systems. They also built families, communities, knowledge, and forms of resistance. Crops did not cross oceans in a neutral exchange detached from human power. Industrialization drew from these global connections. In Britain, accessible coal, transport, wages, institutions, and incentives encouraged coal-intensive machinery. Global resources, colonial markets, accumulated skills, and labor were also integral. Industrial methods later spread and changed across Europe, North America, Japan, Russia, and elsewhere, while extraction and deindustrialization were imposed in some colonized regions. Coal stored solar energy captured by ancient plants. Steam engines converted heat into mechanical work. Railways and steamships moved material with new speed. Oil and gas later expanded the supply of concentrated energy. Steel, cement, fertilizers, and plastics changed the quantity and type of material passing through societies. The benefits were substantial and uneven. Production, transport, comfort, and life expectancy increased for many populations. Pollution, hazardous work, dispossession, and greenhouse emissions were also distributed unequally. Industrial change was neither a gift from one nation nor a force acting outside political choices. After about 1950, many measures rose especially sharply. Population, urbanization, energy use, fertilizer, transport, water use, concrete, plastics, carbon dioxide, methane, land conversion, and species movement form the pattern called the Great Acceleration. Not every curve began in that year, and responsibility differs greatly among nations, classes, industries, and generations. Modern instruments measure atmospheric gases directly. Ice core bubbles from Antarctica place those measurements beside 800,000 years of ancient air. The comparison shows carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide concentrations beyond the range in that record. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessed average global surface temperature for 2011 through 2020 as 1.09 degrees Celsius above the 1850 to 1900 average. human influence has unequivocally warmed atmosphere, ocean, and land. Deep time warm intervals remain useful comparisons, but none exactly reproduces modern conditions. The Paleocene carbon release began in a warmer world with different continents and ecosystems, and its reconstructed average rate differs from present emissions. Ancient climate demonstrates sensitivity to carbon. It does not remove the importance of speed and starting conditions. Geologists have debated whether the scale of modern change warrants a formal Anthropocene epoch. A proposal placed its beginning in the mid-20th century using a particular stratigraphic marker. In 2024, the relevant stratigraphic bodies rejected formal ratification. The Holocene remains the official epoch. That decision concerns how geological time units are defined. It does not reject measured human effects. Anthropocene remains widely used as an informal Earth system and cultural term. A formal boundary must satisfy technical requirements that are narrower than the question of whether industrial societies alter climate, sediment, species distributions, and chemistry. Concrete, plastics, combustion particles, fertilizer signatures, and radioactive fallout can enter sediment. Species have been transported among continents and islands. Rivers are dammed, coasts rebuilt, and material mined from old rock into new objects. Humanity has become a geological influence without becoming the purpose of geology. Recorded history occupies only a very thin interval. Nearly 7/8 of Earth history passed before the Cambrian. Dinosaurs appeared late, and Homo sapiens later still. Agriculture and cities belong to a small portion of the current interglacial. Industrial measurements cover a final sliver. The scale does not make human lives unimportant. It places them inside exchanges that began before life. Heat moving outward, rock weathering, water circulating, gases entering and leaving the atmosphere. Microbes added oxygen. Plants stored carbon. Continents redirected oceans. Ice preserved air. People learned to read these traces, and then began leaving signals that future rock may retain. There is no summit at the end of this history. Living bacteria are not relics waiting below complex life. Birds continue one dinosaur lineage. Human populations are branches among branches, carrying cultures that cannot be ranked by whether they built in stone or wrote on clay. Civilization is a description of certain social arrangements, not Earth's destination. The oldest calendar began in meteorite minerals. The latest entries are kept by instruments, archives, and sediments still forming. Between them lies a planet that has never been finished, only repeatedly assembled, altered, inhabited, and read. Written dates occupy the narrow edge of that archive, while beneath them, the older exchanges continue at their patient scales. Those patient scales are not empty intervals between memorable events. They are where evidence acquires its order. A river lays younger sediment over older sediment. A fault cuts through rock that had to exist before the break. Magma enters an earlier layer and cools within it. erosion removes part of the sequence, leaving a gap that may represent more time than all the rock above it. The history of Earth is read not from one clock, but from relationships among many clocks and many damaged pages. Superposition gives a basic rule. In an undisturbed stack of sedimentary layers, the lower layer was deposited first. Folding can overturn a sequence, burrowing can mix its surface, and faults can move one block beside another. So the rule must be checked against structures in the rock. A simple principle becomes useful only after geology has finished making it less simple. Cross-cutting relationships provide another order. A mineral vein must be younger than the rock it crosses. A crater must be younger than the surface it interrupts. Fragments enclosed inside a later rock existed first. These relations do not immediately supply years, but they establish before and after. Long before accurate numerical dating, geologists built a relative chronology from such observations. Fossils added a way to compare distant layers. Species appeared, changed, spread, and disappeared in recognizable sequences. A fossil found in two separated basins could help correlate rocks even where their sediments differed. Ammonites became especially useful for portions of the Mesozoic because they evolved rapidly, spread widely through seas, and left abundant shells. Microfossils later allowed equally fine comparisons from small samples and deep-sea cores. Fossil succession still carries uncertainty. A lineage may have lived before its earliest known fossil. Local environment can keep it out of a region. Reworking can erode an old fossil and deposit it in younger sediment. A final appearance may mark migration or a missing layer rather than global extinction. Correlation therefore uses groups of fossils, sedimentary context, and independent dates rather than trusting one convenient shell with the whole calendar. Earth's magnetic field supplies another pattern. As lava cools or sediment settles, magnetic minerals can align with the field and retain a remnant direction. The field has reversed many times, exchanging magnetic north and south. Sequences of normal and reversed polarity form a barcode that can be matched among ocean crust, volcanic layers, and sediment cores. The symmetrical magnetic bands on either side of mid-ocean ridges helped establish seafloor spreading. Fresh crust formed at a ridge, moved outward, and recorded successive reversals. Ocean basins were not permanent depressions. Their floors were conveyor-like archives created and eventually consumed, which explains why very ancient oceanic crust is scarce. Orbital rhythms can also enter sediment. Seasonal layers, changing plankton communities, dust, and carbonate content may follow variations in precession, tilt, and eccentricity. When a sequence preserves enough cycles, astronomical calculations can refine its timing. These methods complement radiometric dates rather than replacing them. Each operates where the right material and duration exist. The formal geological timescale joins relative order with numerical ages. A period boundary is commonly fixed at a physical reference section, sometimes marked by a symbolic golden spike. The reference allows geologists to point to a level in rock and correlate it elsewhere. Its assigned numerical age can improve as dating improves without moving the physical definition. That distinction explains why decimal ages can change between editions of a chart. A better laboratory value does not rewrite the order of the periods. It refines the estimate attached to a boundary. Geological time is both a sequence grounded in rock and a numerical framework built through measurement. Some boundaries are tied to biological appearances, isotope changes, or magnetic reversals. None implies that every place on Earth changed at one instant. A marine organism used to mark a boundary may not have lived on land or in every sea. Correlation identifies equivalent time through several signals. The border on a chart is much sharper than the world it describes. The archive is biased before anyone samples it. Sediment accumulates in basins, floodplains, lakes, deltas, caves, and seas. Mountain tops usually erode. Tropical soils can destroy bone. Acidic ground dissolves shell. Dry caves may preserve fibers that vanish in open ground. Waterlogged sites can retain wood and seeds. Frozen ground can preserve tissues for long intervals, though thaw and microbes resume their patient work. An organism with a hard shell has better odds than a soft-bodied one. An abundant coastal species has better odds than a rare animal living in an eroding upland. A pollen grain may travel far beyond its parent plant. A large bone may be noticed, while a microscopic tooth passes through a sieve. Preservation and discovery each select their own sample. Exceptional fossil deposits are valuable because they interrupt ordinary selection. Fine sediment, low oxygen, mineral films, rapid burial, or microbial mats can preserve soft anatomy. Yet even an exceptional deposit captures one habitat during particular episodes. The Burgess Shale reveals what shell beds omit, but it does not reveal every Cambrian sea. Trace fossils preserve behavior without preserving a body. A burrow records movement through sediment. Footprints record gait, weight, group spacing, or a pause on wet ground. Coprolites preserve food residues after digestion. Bite marks and repaired shell damage record interactions. These objects can show that a behavior existed without always naming its maker. Chemical traces widen the archive again. Carbon isotopes can reveal disturbances in the carbon cycle or biological fractionation. Sulfur isotopes can constrain atmospheric oxygen and microbial processes. Strontium can track weathering and ocean chemistry. Oxygen isotopes can carry information about temperature, ice volume, or ancient water-rock interaction. The same element does different work according to mineral, setting, and age. A proxy is not a disguised thermometer waiting to be read. It is a measured feature linked to an environmental process through physics, chemistry, experiments, and comparison. Other influences must be identified. The oxygen ratio in a deep-sea shell reflects both temperature and the isotope composition of seawater. The ratio in a zircon concerns its source and alteration. Context turns a number into evidence. Multiple proxies are strongest when their weaknesses differ. Fossils may indicate ecological response, while isotopes record chemistry. Ash beds may supply numerical dates, while magnetic reversals align a wider sequence. Sediment structures identify water depth or current. Agreement among them reduces the chance that one altered sample controls the account. Disagreement is equally useful. It can reveal later heating, contamination, reworking, poor calibration, or an incorrect model. Patterson's struggle with laboratory lead was one version of this ordinary scientific pressure. A measurement that fails to fit may expose a modern contaminant before it exposes a new planet. The record of human societies adds different biases. Stone tools survive better than wooden handles, baskets, nets, clothing, or spoken instructions. A stone point may therefore dominate a collection, even when plant gathering, fiber work, and food preparation occupied more daily time. Caves preserve repeated visits, but many communities lived in open places, later eroded or submerged. Charred plant remains survive because burning transforms delicate tissue into stable carbon. Flotation in archaeological work separates small seeds from soil, allowing meals, weeds, fuel, and crop processing to be studied. Pollen and starch grains add other scales. A storage pit can reveal planned return and seasonal surplus without revealing every person who used it. Animal bones preserve choices about herding, hunting, butchery, and food distribution. The ages and sexes represented in a herd can differ under managed breeding from a wild kill. Changes in horn cores or body size may accompany domestication. Stable isotopes in teeth can indicate movement between geological regions. None of these signs alone defines a household economy. Residues absorbed into pottery can retain fats and other compounds. Grinding stones carry microscopic wear and starch. Floors accumulate ash, broken tools, food fragments, and repair layers. Drains preserve what formal inscriptions rarely celebrate. The ordinary household leaves an archive through repetition. Bodies and teeth can record diet, illness, migration, and work, but they require respectful interpretation. A burial is an individual as well as evidence. Grave arrangement may reflect ritual, affection, rank, age, or community practice without yielding a complete belief system. Absence of an elaborate grave does not establish an absence of care. Settlement plans make institutions visible in indirect ways. Standardized bricks or weights indicate shared practices. Streets and drainage require maintenance. Workshops concentrate debris from particular crafts. Storage buildings suggest collection and redistribution, though their political control must be demonstrated rather than assumed. A large building may be a palace, temple, meeting place, warehouse, or several of these through time. Monuments are unusually visible because they were designed to endure, and because later investigators favored them. The houses beside them may reveal more about diet, labor, and family. A state can carve its victories into stone while omitting failed harvests, negotiation, and the people who supplied the stone. Official records are evidence of administration and also evidence of what administrators wished to count. Early tablets from Uruk dealt heavily in quantities, goods, and labor. Their survival provides close access to institutional habits while leaving much speech unheard. A mark for grain may be clearer than the feelings of the worker who carried it. Writing greatly expands historical detail, but it does not remove selection. It creates a new selecting institution. Royal inscriptions often present order as the work of one ruler. King lists create clean succession even when power was regional or disputed. Victory texts enlarge success and reduce rivals. Law collections reveal ideals and categories, though daily judgment may have depended on local practice. Reading them against household archaeology and environmental evidence produces a less polished history, and usually a more human one. Undeciphered writing occupies a useful middle ground. Indus signs show repeated conventions, placement, and social use, but no secure reading reveals their language. It is possible to study the contexts of seals without inventing translations. The refusal to read what cannot yet be read is itself an archival skill. Oral histories and indigenous knowledge preserve roots, genealogies, place relationships, environmental observations, and events through forms different from administrative writing. They are not timeless folklore floating outside history. They belong to communities, languages, purposes, and changing conditions. Used carefully and with appropriate authority, they can guide archaeology and correct accounts built only from colonial records. Colonial archives carry the priorities of officials, missionaries, merchants, and courts. They may document taxes and land seizure closely while misrepresenting the people affected. Indigenous petitions, material culture, oral testimony, and archaeology supply other perspectives. No archive becomes neutral merely because its paper has aged attractively. Industrial societies produce so much documentation that abundance creates another problem. Census forms, shipping records, patents, newspapers, photographs, instruments, and digital data can overwhelm selection. Their survival depends on institutions, formats, and power. A numerical series may appear comprehensive while excluding unpaid work or communities outside administrative reach. Earth system instruments create records with calibrated procedures. Thermometers, satellites, ocean floats, gas analyzers, and tide gauges measure different parts of a changing planet. Historical observations can be corrected for known station changes and compared across methods. Climate assessment does not depend on one warm year or one instrument. It combines broad, independently checked records. Ice cores join this instrumental era to older air. Tree rings, corals, lake sediments, and cave minerals extend other environmental series with different seasonal and regional strengths. Deep-sea cores carry the record farther, and rock chemistry farther still. Precision decreases or changes character with age, but the chain does not end at the first written weather diary. Modern sediment carries its own uneven signals. Reservoirs trap material that rivers once carried to deltas, and dams alter seasonal flow. Fertilizer changes the movement of nitrogen and phosphorus. Combustion leaves distinctive particles. Concrete and plastics enter deposits in forms rare or absent before industrial production. Radioactive fallout supplies widespread time markers from the mid-20th century. A future geologist would not find one uniform human layer covering every surface. Erosion would remove much of it. Ocean sediment, lake beds, caves, deltas, landfills, and undisturbed soils would preserve different signals. Some cities would be dismantled by water, weathering, and tectonics. Ceramics and altered minerals might persist after steel corroded and organic material vanished. This unevenness helped complicate the formal Anthropocene proposal. A geological boundary needs a clear definition and a reference that can be correlated. Human influence began at different times according to the process measured. Agriculture, species movement, colonial exchange, coal combustion, greenhouse gases, or nuclear fallout. Choosing a mid-20th century marker offered precision, but also raised questions about whether an epoch was the best formal unit. Rejecting the proposal left the Holocene unchanged on the formal chart. The vote did not erase industrial sediment or atmospheric measurements. Geological classification and Earth system description answer related but distinct questions. A word may remain useful in history and ecology without becoming a ratified epoch. Civilization raises a similar problem of definition. Archaeologists can compare urban density, state administration, writing, craft specialization, and regional influence, but these traits do not always travel together. A large community may lack royal monuments. A state may govern mostly rural settlements. A society may transmit complex law and memory without writing. Definitions organize comparison. They do not measure human worth, nor does complexity move only upward. Cities shrink, governments fragment, trade routes shift, and writing systems fall out of use. People adapt by moving, changing crops, forming smaller communities, or joining new political networks. The end of a palace does not mean the end of its potters, farmers, children, or stories. Collapse is often an aerial word, placed over many local continuities. Earth history contains the same warning against ladders. Oxygen did not rise steadily. Complexity did not replace microbes. Marine life moved onto land in branches, and some mammal descendants returned to water. Ice expanded and retreated. Continents joined and separated. Direction appears in particular trends, but the whole history has no appointed destination. The methods used to recover it are therefore deliberately modest. A date includes uncertainty. A fossil name may change when new anatomy is found. A climate reconstruction uses a range. A continental map carries pale borders that should not be mistaken for coastlines surveyed in the field. Better evidence can narrow one question and open another. That modesty does not weaken the broad account. Meteorite minerals securely place the solar system's first solids near 4,567,000,000 years ago. Lead isotopes securely place Earth near 4,540,000,000 years. Zircons establish very early crust and water interaction. Sulfur isotopes establish atmospheric change. Fossils establish branching evolution. Boundary clay and a crater establish an impact. Genomes establish meetings among human populations. Instruments establish modern warming. Confidence can be strong without becoming absolute in every detail. Giant impact remains the best framework for moon formation, while its geometry varies among models. Life existed early, while its first pathway remains unknown. Extensive cryogen unglaciation is secure, while tropical sea ice conditions remain debated. Chicxulub triggered the end Cretaceous extinction, while volcanism affected the surrounding world. Each distinction keeps curiosity from turning into false mystery. Unknown does not mean unknowable, and debated does not mean every answer has equal support. Evidence can favor one framework while leaving room inside it. The archive is incomplete, but it is not silent. Its most common contents are not catastrophes. Most sediment settles without marking a mass extinction. Most organisms live and disappear without becoming fossils. Most tools are used, resharpened, and discarded in ordinary work. Most written signs count grain, land, labor, and exchange rather than announcing a new age. Those ordinary repetitions built the record. Microbes returned elements to water. Roots opened cracks. Shells fell to the seafloor. People repaired canals, swept floors, saved seed, and carried fuel. Instruments took another reading. None had to understand the full system to become part of it. At the shortest scale, a measurement may take seconds. At the longest, mantle heat escapes across billions of years. Human institutions operate between them, inheriting consequences from climates, soils, oceans, and earlier choices. Their archives are young enough to be detailed and old enough to contain many warnings against simple stories. The planet beneath those archives continues to sort and exchange material. Ocean crust forms and is recycled. Continents weather into sediment. Carbon moves among air, water, life, and rock. The moon recedes gradually through tides. No formal boundary interrupts these processes. The final page is therefore still being deposited, not written in advance. Its layers will be partial, regionally varied, and altered by whatever follows. The oldest surviving grain and the newest instrument reading belong to one long practice of inference, separated by almost all of Earth history. Between them, patient processes keep their own order, whether or not anyone gives the interval a name. A name fixes a useful place in a sequence, not a wall around the processes on either side. Periods and epochs are tools for comparing change at human scale. Their boundaries let a geologist in one basin communicate with another working across an ocean. The rock itself continues through the line, carrying old minerals into young sediment and old genes into new populations. This continuity is why Earth's eras overlap in their consequences. Carbon fixed by a carboniferous plant can remain underground until an industrial furnace returns it to air. Sand weathered from an ancient mountain can be buried, hardened, uplifted, and weathered again. A gene inherited from a bacterial ancestor can operate inside a complex cell billions of years later. Deep history is not stored safely behind the present. It supplies the present's material. Time also changes the resolution of the archive. A modern instrument can take repeated readings through one day. An ice core may distinguish seasons or years in favorable layers. A deep-sea core can resolve longer intervals, while an altered R-key unrock may combine events separated by spans that would contain entire written histories. The farther back the inquiry reaches, the less often the evidence permits a close scene. That loss of resolution should shape the story. Accretion is described as a process, not a diary of impacts. The great oxidation event spans a transition, not a morning with suddenly breathable air. Supercontinents are reconstructed as broad arrangements rather than exact coastlines. These limits are not failures of imagination. They keep imagination from replacing evidence. Near the present, the opposite problem appears. Evidence multiplies. A single century can contain millions of documents and measurements. Detail invites the claim that recent events matter more because they can be narrated more closely. Deep time invites the claim that only great changes matter because smaller lives are hard to recover. Both impressions come partly from the archive's changing resolution. Microbial communities occupied most of life's history without leaving personal scenes. Their chemistry nonetheless altered minerals, oceans, and air. Early farmers often remain unnamed, while their harvesting choices changed plants over generations. Laborers who made bricks or carried ingots may appear only through fingerprints, wear, and discarded tools. Lack of a written name is not lack of agency. Named scientists enter the story late because modern publication records individual work. Even there, discovery remains collective. Patterson's measurements depended on earlier isotope physics, meteorite collections, instruments, and laboratory practice. The Alvarez hypothesis became persuasive through tests by many teams. Ice core climate records require drilling, logistics, chemistry, dating, and comparison. A convenient name can anchor a narrative without owning the evidence. The same applies to famous specimens. Lucy is one Australopith individual among wider populations. Archaeopteryx is one branch within feathered dinosaur diversity. Tiktaalik clarifies a transition without being appointed ancestor of every tetrapod. A famous object becomes a doorway into a pattern, not the solitary cause of it. Museums and textbooks often rely on such doorways because 4.5 billion years do not fit easily into ordinary attention. A meteorite, zircon, iron band, feather impression, hand X, seed, tablet, or air bubble gives the scale a physical anchor. Each object is small enough to study closely and old enough to point beyond itself. The choice of anchor influences which history seems central. Bones favor animals. Monuments favor rulers and institutions. Written archives favor literate administrations. Ocean cores favor marine and climate processes. A balanced account moves among objects so that one preservational advantage does not become a theory of importance. There are also silences that cannot be filled. The first living chemistry may have left no recognizable trace. Most species vanished without fossils. Most languages were never written, and many recorded languages were later lost. Coastlines used by glacial period communities now lie underwater. Erosion has removed landscapes that once carried entire ecosystems. Silence can support limits, but not any desired invention. An absent fossil may mean a lineage has not yet been found, yet it does not prove the lineage existed at any chosen date. An undeciphered sign may encode language, identity, quantity, or ritual, but it cannot support a convenient royal speech. Responsible uncertainty has edges. Within those edges, new discoveries can rearrange emphasis. An older trackway can move the minimum age of a group. A genome can reveal a population barely known from bones. A more precise ash date can separate events once merged. Drilling can recover crater rock beneath younger sediment. Better instruments do not merely add facts. They change which questions the archive can answer. The broad history remains stable enough to hold those revisions. Earth formed through accretion and differentiation. Life changed surface chemistry. Evolution branched through changing environments. Tectonics rearranged geography. Climate moved under solar, orbital, atmospheric, oceanic, biological, and geological influences. Humans emerged within that history and became unusually powerful agents of material change. None of those statements requires a ladder. Branching is the more durable shape. A branch may diversify, persist with modest change, merge through interbreeding, or end. Ecosystems assemble from lineages with separate pasts. Human societies borrow crops, words, metals, rituals, and techniques without entering one universal sequence. Cycles are equally useful only with care. Rock can be melted and remade, but no cycle returns the exact same mountain. Carbon moves among reservoirs, but the rate and route determine climate effects. Ice advances again, though each glaciation meets different geography and biology. Repetition in process does not mean repetition in outcome. The present is one such outcome. It contains cratons older than complex cells, oxygen made possible by ancient microbes, soils influenced by plants, and fuels made from earlier life. It also contains social systems built over generations too recent to become more than a surface trace in geological terms. Vast age and immediate consequence occupy the same ground. Future change remains outside a history of evidence. Models can test possibilities, and measurements can establish trends, but narration should not pretend to remember what has not happened. The archive supports responsibility without requiring prophecy. It shows that rapid changes have consequences, that recovery takes specific forms, and that no environment is detached from material exchange. At human scale, 3 hours is long enough for a story and almost absent from geology. At microbial scale, it may contain many generations. At tectonic scale, it is no interval at all. Duration has meaning only in relation to a process. The same is true of importance. A thin boundary clay can matter because it carries a global signal. A tiny zircon can matter because most older rock is gone. A fragment of finger bone can matter because its genome identifies a population. A charred seed can matter because it records selection before a written agricultural theory. Small evidence can bear broad conclusions when the chain of reasoning is sound. The chain always returns to material. Isotopes supply dates. Anatomy and genes reveal relationships. Shells, gases, minerals, and instruments retain climates, while buildings, refuse, signs, roads, and bodies retain institutions. Myth enters only when a simple compression is mistaken for the evidence beneath it. Earth was never a finished sphere awaiting occupants. Oxygen did not arrive for animals. Dinosaurs did not occupy a temporary stage intended for mammals. Ice ages did not prepare migration routes for people. Agriculture and industry were not waiting goals. Later consequences can be traced without turning them into earlier purposes. That may be the quietest lesson held by the archive. Causes work forward, while stories are often told backward. Knowing the ending makes each old branch look like a road. The rocks retain the intersections, dead ends, parallel routes, and crossings that the road leaves out. The present rests among those crossings. Its official epoch retains a name given to the recent whole, while informal language tries to describe changes occurring within it. Its instruments are precise, its institutions uneven, and its sediments already selective. Nothing about being recent makes it separate from geology. Rain still weathers exposed rock. Rivers still sort grains by current. Organisms still alter air and water. Ash still settles. Shells still reach the seafloor. Human work redirects many of these motions, sometimes locally and sometimes around the planet. But the evidence enters the archive through the same material world. Long after a name is chosen or rejected, a layer remains only if circumstances preserve it. Long after a city changes, its drains may outlast its declarations. Long after an organism disappears, a trace may retain one movement across soft ground. History is carried by these unlikely survivals. They do not form a complete book, and no final volume waits at the end. They form enough of an order to show a restless planet without assigning it a destination. In that order, the newest layer rests lightly above the rest, unfinished and ordinary, while the deeper record keeps almost all of its time.